Good evening. I'd like to call to order our Town of Sydney regular council meeting on Monday, February 28th, 2022 to order at 6 p.m. Hello to members of the public watching the live webcast or to those watching a recording of the meeting at a later date. I am Mayor McNeil Smith here in the council chamber, and with me is Councillor Garnett to my left and Councillor Duncan to my right. Our four colleagues joining us via Zoom. You can see them on your screen. Good evening to Councillor Barbara Fallett, Councillor Terry O'Keefe, Councillor Chad Rintoul, and Councillor Peter Wainwright. We have several staff in the chamber this evening, and other staff will be joining us via Zoom virtually. And I'd next like to turn to the Territorial Acknowledgement and acknowledge that we are holding this evening's meeting in the territory of the Wasanich Nations. We express our gratitude to the Wasanich people for their stewardship of these lands and waters for millennia. And as we turn to our agenda this evening and to the update of our official community plan, the most important planning document in our local government, let us be mindful of the impacts that our policies and goals have on jointly stewarding these lands with Wasanich people. I'll turn to approval of the agenda. We do have a couple of changes. The first is I would like to just change the order slightly of our agenda. We do have a presentation this evening on the draft official community plan. I would like to move that presentation after some of the brief initial agenda items, and it will come right before Mr. Corey Newcomb's presentation and staff report. So it will be just before 13. I anticipate that'll be about 15 minutes or so. And we have three items received since the agenda was published on Thursday. The first is a letter that we'll place under 14A from Ms. Laurie McDermott regarding summer markets, and two letters, one from Mr. Adrian Kershaw, one from Mr. Eric Diller with regards to OCP. We'll place those under 15.2. And with that, I would look for approval of the agenda as amended, please.
I'll move the agenda as amended.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor? None opposed. A motion carries. Thank you. And so then we'll turn to section 7, which is adoption of minutes. We have minutes from our regular council meeting of February 14th, 2022.
Move adoption.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any errors, omissions, or discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? None opposed, motion carries. And we have the minutes from our special council budget meeting on February 22nd, 2022.
Move adoption.
Second.
Moved by Councillor Wainwright, seconded by Councillor O'Keefe. Any errors or omissions? Seeing none, all in favor? None opposed, that motion carries. Thank you. I'm next turning to section 9 on the agenda, which is rise and report from in-camera minutes. And so I have two motions to read that council made at in-camera meetings. The first was at the regular council in-camera meeting on November 8th. And the resolution was that, number one, that Mayor McNeil Smith be appointed as the Town of Sydney Council representative to the newly formed Integrated Police Unit Regional Governance Council. And two, that a rise and report of the appointment be made immediately following the initial meeting of that council. That meeting was held very recently, and this is the first council meeting since that meeting, so there was a press release, and that committee is now underway. Council is now underway. The second is a motion from our regular council in-camera meeting of January 10th, 2022, and the resolution is that Larry Powell be appointed to the Victoria Airport Authority Noise Management Committee for a one-year term ending December 31st, 2022, and we want to thank Mr. Powell for volunteering his time to sit as a citizen appointment on that VAA Noise Management Committee. I'll next turn to the Mayor's report, and tonight I just have a couple of highlights within the CRD board highlights from the February board meeting, and the first is with regards, Council will recall that the CRD board had established in its strategic priorities looking at the feasibility of establishing a regional performing arts facility service. And at our most recent meeting, we had requested staff bring forward details on a region-wide referendum as a potential method of gaining electoral approval for a new full regional performing arts facility service. The CRD board decided not to proceed with that service at this time and has directed that the matter be referred to the strategic planning section of the session of the new board. The second is the CRD board accepted the draft of the new regional parks strategic plan and have directed staff to proceed with engagement of the public at large, First Nations, and a range of other stakeholders. And an updated plan will be presented to the CRD board for consideration in July of this year. And a note to Sydney residents and those interested that there is a survey as part of that engagement process that will be available through their website. If I could have a motion to receive that CRD board highlights for February for information.
Move receipt.
Second.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any questions or discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? None opposed, the motion carries. Thank you. And next, under council reports, I'll turn to Councillor Duncan, who will, our liaison to the, our representative from council on the CRD Water Commission, and who has a verbal report. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. Yeah, just briefly, we received an update on the pH and corrosion study that the Water Commission has been doing for the past couple of years that we were required to do due to the updates in the Canadian guidelines for lead in drinking water. Previously, the CRD had tested our reservoir water and the water in our main distribution system, the distribution systems throughout the municipalities and some of the larger municipalities, and found there's no lead anywhere in our water supply. Oak Bay, I believe, had briefly had elevated in their distribution node, and all they had to do was replace one of the fittings that was inside, and that got rid of that problem. This time they did a second sweep of households to test the remaining ones that were left, and Sydney was included in that. They were missed in the first time, and then it was cut short due to COVID. We had, in all of the households that were retested in the remaining municipalities, only one household of the 142 tested had one exceedance, and that one household was in Sydney. However, it was an older household, and it was the first flush, and it was still just a blip above it. So everybody can rest assured that our water is good, and even with the new lead guidelines, we are below that. If you're somebody who lives in one of the older houses, say built between 1940 and 1968, when they changed the lead guidelines in pipe fittings, and you are concerned, you can always get your water tested at a laboratory. And if you don't want to do that, just run your tap for 2 minutes first thing in the morning to get that first flush out where any lead might have actually seeped in if you had it. But the likelihood of that applying to many people in Sydney is very low. So good news update. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. If we could move that receipt for a verbal report for information.
Move receipt.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion or questions? Seeing none, all in favor? None opposed. That motion carries. Thank you. So we'll now turn to presentations, and I see our first presenter, Mr. Rob Bars, on the screen, participating virtually. Mr. Bars, if you'd like to confirm your audio connection, I'd be pleased to introduce.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we do have Mr. Rob Bars, a principal with Modus Planning Design and Engagement, presenting the draft official community plan this evening. As council knows, in our procedure bylaw, we allocate 10 minutes for presentations. Mr. Barr's presentations will be a little longer than that this evening, so I would move that the time to present be extended beyond 10 minutes.
Second.
I'll call the question. All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. And good evening, Mr. Bars. You do have the time you need to present to council. We'd be pleased if you take questions following your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, members of council. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here tonight to present the draft OCP, which has taken us a while to get to this point. So it's exciting for us that we can present this to you tonight. I've probably got about a 20-minute presentation, and then my colleague Jessica Mann and also your staff member Corey Newcomb are here to answer questions at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to try and share my screen so I can present a PowerPoint presentation for you. Just give me 1 second while I do that, please.
Certainly. And we can see that now.
Okay, and I'm just going to switch it to presenter view so that you can see the full thing. Now, can you see the whole slide, or can you see some notes next to it?
We can see the whole slide.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm going to take you through really tonight just a high-level overview of the draft OCP. Of course, it is quite a long document, and I believe you've had a chance to review it, most of you. So I'll present the high-level overview and entertain questions at the end. So I'll take you through briefly the project process. So just to remind you of the various stages we've been through to develop this OCP and the opportunities that the public and stakeholders have had to weigh in on the process, which has been quite extensive. Then I'll take you through some of the key highlights of the draft, just kind of touching on the key points that have changed since the last OCP. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have questions at the end. So taking a look at the project process. So this has been it's a 4-phase process in total. So we started in phase 1, if you can cast your mind back over a year now, to a period where we did the project initiation and background review, and that was from May through to August of 2020. Then we had a phase called Explore Options that went from September through to August of 2021. And we're currently coming towards the end of phase 3, which is where we've been drafting the plan. So we're nearing the end of that, and then there will be a final phase 4 where we finalize the document and it's presented to you hopefully for adoption as a bylaw. So in phase 1, we did quite a lot of background review and research so that we were very familiar with the background of the town and some of your existing policies and plans and some of the policies and plans of the region and adjacent municipalities. We also have a climate sub-consultant working with us, Integral, who did some work on looking at the climate emissions of the town, also of the regional policy, and did some modeling work to understand kind of where emissions might go depending on different policy decisions. We developed a fairly extensive communications and engagement strategy, which was then implemented in phase 2. We started with some stakeholder interviews, so interviewing town staff. We had a workshop with yourselves, council, and also talked to other stakeholders within the community. And this all resulted in a background and recommendation report, which you saw previously. In phase 2, we really focused on public and stakeholder engagement. So we had over 1,600 unique interactions with the community. We had a public launch event, which was thankfully in person at the time. So we were able to squeeze that in before many of the COVID restrictions were implemented. We had an online ideas forum using the BYLAWS platform, and we had over 100 different ideas that were submitted from the public. We distributed and gave the opportunity for what we called OC Pizza Night workbooks. So we had gave the opportunity to the public to talk about the issues and ideas and opportunities for the OCP. We had a special session with some of our regional planning partners, so adjacent municipalities and some of the regional organizations that have an interest in Sydney in the area. We had a multi-day design charrette where we invited members of different stakeholder groups to work with us looking at different design elements, including the downtown. We did a survey with residents looking at community design options. We had a special workshop on economic development. And throughout all this time, we had a number of meetings with the WSANH Leadership Council, and also we had a WSANH community forum to gather ideas from various WSANH communities. And then finally, staff led a workshop with local youth as well. So quite an extensive engagement process to get to this point. So phase 2 resulted in a vision and a set of goals. We revised the OCP structure, and we developed a number of key policy directions, which you saw at a previous meeting, and we discussed at length at a previous meeting, including issues of building heights in the downtown, the issue of ground floor residential in the downtown, additional types of dwellings within the neighborhood residential category, the use of multi-unit residential in and around the Mermaid Creek area to try and create rehabilitation of Mermaid Creek, extensive improvements to the cycling network and active transportation generally, and improvements to housing policy, including affordable and rental housing policy. So we'll talk about how we've integrated those key directions into the OCP as we go through this presentation. So I'll take you through the highlights of the OCP now. So this is how the document is currently structured, the draft that's in front of you. So we have an introduction, of course, which talks about some of the history of the town and also of the WSANH communities in the peninsula, and talks about the kind of local, regional, and sub-regional context for the OCP. Then we have the vision and goals. So we have we state the vision and goals and where those came from. We have a future land use section, which has the land use map with the various different designations on it, and it also describes what is allowed within each one of those land use designations. Then the most key section is the policies section. So this is divided into 6 different subsections, and the policies are organized around the 6 goals of the OCP. We've done a lot of work to the DPA guidelines, the Development Permit Area Guidelines, and that's its own section. And then we have a series of maps at the end, which are referred to as schedules. So the vision, I'll briefly read out the vision because I think it's important to set the context for the overall OCP. So the town of Sydney, known as Satinas to the WSANH peoples, will continue to be a lively and welcoming seaside town at the commercial heart of the Saanich Peninsula. Sydney will be built on its reputation as a friendly, inclusive community to deepen its relationship with WSANH peoples and reflect the rich cultural history of the area. Sydney will address the climate emergency by both reducing its emissions and increasing its resilience to shocks and change. Sydney will protect and enhance its natural areas and open spaces to create thriving, biodiverse ecosystems and healthy places for recreation and reflection. Sydney will work hard to foster a vibrant downtown and a thriving local economy underpinned by a healthy, diverse community, housing choice, and supportive amenities that emphasize health, happiness, and prosperity at all stages of life. So that forms the foundation for the document. We've developed a series of goals, and as I mentioned, the goals form the getting a little bit of feedback there, sorry. The goals form the structure of the policy section of the OCP. So we have a regionally connected, vibrant downtown, a distinct seaside town reflecting local history, cultural, and context, connected, accessible, and livable neighborhoods that meet the needs of the whole community, a diverse and balanced community supporting a thriving local economy, biodiverse, connected ecosystems informed by traditional, local, and scientific knowledge, and a healthy, resilient community that takes action to address climate change. I just wanted to present here the land use categories, or the designations as we call them in the OCP. So these are largely unchanged from the previous OCP from 2007. So you've still got the category, the residential categories, commercial and mixed use categories, industrial, and then institutional, marine, and park categories. So these are largely the same as you've seen in your previous OCP. The land use map is also largely the same. Like Sydney obviously is largely a built-out community, and land uses are not going to change substantially, but we have made minor changes, and these are highlighted with the black line around them on the future land use map that you're seeing in front of you. So the key changes are to support more complete and walkable neighborhoods. So what we've done is added multi-unit residential land uses around some of the neighborhood commercial nodes. And the idea there is to try and support walkability, support the ability of more residents to have access, walkable access to daily shopping and amenities. So that's one of the key changes. The other area where we've introduced some multifamily uses is around the Mermaid Creek area. And the idea there is to support the rehabilitation of Mermaid Creek, which does suffer from excessive stormwater and is piped in much of its course. So the idea would be to introduce multifamily as and when owners want to redevelop their properties. And this would allow us to open up Mermaid Creek, daylight portions of it, and also set back buildings from the creek in order to protect it. So this would be a long-term change, but I think a worthy one over time. Multifamily residential has also been introduced to allow the extension of the waterfront walkway north of the downtown. So again, a multifamily, if that is introduced, when that change happened, would allow you to require buildings to be set back in order to create a publicly accessible waterfront walkway. And some of the other changes are to reflect the West Side local area plan and the land uses that were associated with that plan that was adopted and supported by council. So the OCP, really one of the key moves that we've made is to try and bolster the strength of neighborhoods. And one of the things is to introduce neighborhood commercial policy areas. So the idea here is to expand local neighborhood uses in select areas so that you can create additional commercial areas that will support walkability, support those daily needs of residents within those neighborhoods. And so these commercial policy areas would encourage council to look at allowing additional commercial in these areas. And so it's a policy. It's not actually a land use designation at the moment, because it gives you the ability for some discretion at the time that applications come forward, or at the time that staff might proactively suggest these changes. There are, as I mentioned, the ability to add townhouses and multifamily development to support those types of local commercial uses as well. In addition, we've added the ability for additional garden suites and secondary suites and duplexes, encourage those in the neighborhood residential category. And we've added housing policies to encourage affordable housing and rental housing. And that reflects your housing needs assessment that was received by council a couple of years ago. Finally, there's been a fair number of changes to the guidelines, the development permit area guidelines that regulate form and character of development in the multi-unit residential, commercial, and industrial areas. And the idea of this is to try and improve the form and character of development within the town, and have it be compatible with existing development and the character of the overall town. As you might expect, we heard a lot through the process about the importance of the local environment in Sydney. and clearly, people value the local environment a lot. And so we've introduced additional policies related to partnerships, having a strong environmental lens on decision making, connecting habitats, preservation of environmentally sensitive areas, outreach to the community and community stewardship of environmental areas, protecting water resources, protecting the marine environment, pollution and impact mitigation, and the idea of natural assets and infrastructure. So kind of looking at natural areas and ecosystems as part of your overall infrastructure that provides services to the town. So we've expanded and hopefully improved the environmentally sensitive areas, development permit areas and guidelines. And you can see outlined on the map there, the additional environmentally sensitive areas, development permit areas. There have been a number of improvements and strengthening of your transportation policies, especially the active transportation policies that will guide the upcoming active transportation plan. So you currently have an RFP out for an active transportation plan, and so the OCP will provide important policy guidance for that forthcoming plan. There are policies to expand the recreational trail system, including the public waterfront walkway north to Rothsay Avenue. And there are also guidelines and policies to prioritize and support the uptake of alternative vehicles, such as electric vehicles or low emission vehicles, as well as micro mobility like scooters and electric bikes, etc. One of the key things that we've heard through the process, including from council, is the importance of managing downtown heights of buildings in the downtown. So we have developed a key map that you can see on the screen here that guides the heights of buildings within the downtown. So allowing for slightly higher buildings in the area west of Fifth Avenue, in that area A there, and then maintaining 3-story maximum along Beacon Avenue in the area C, and then 4 stories within the rest of the downtown. So slight changes within the overall downtown heights, trying to respect the kind of character and future intentions of the different areas within the downtown. There's also been the issue of ground floor residential within the downtown. So within Beacon Avenue itself, we want to maintain commercial uses on the ground floor, but in the shoulder areas, in those areas B and either side of Beacon, there is the ability to allow ground floor residential when council thinks it's appropriate. So this is a policy. It does allow you, again, to have some discretion in those decisions on a case-by-case basis, but the policy encourages you to think about the option for residential on the ground floor where it makes sense. We've introduced a number of policies and associated form and character guidelines as well to strengthen climate action. So the objectives and policies build on the commitment that you've already made to climate action and with the climate emergency. And so we have a much strengthened policy framework around climate action in one of the chapters, and also renewed greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, so reflecting a goal of net zero carbon by 2050, which is aligned with the regional targets and also aligned with the targets from the IPCC as well. We've also developed a number of sustainability guidelines that have been incorporated into the form and character guidelines of the development permit areas. So this allows you to do a little bit of extra work around greenhouse gas emission reductions, energy and water conservation as well. So So that's the policies. So just briefly, I'll talk about the development permit area guidelines and the structure of these, because this has been a quite substantially revised area of the OCP. So we've got the environmentally sensitive areas, development permit areas. So these cover marine, foreshore, and also riparian. We've got public realm and open space guidelines. We've got a set of sustainability guidelines, and then we've got the form and character guidelines, which apply to general residential. They also apply to commercial and mixed use and to industrial. So there are different sets of guidelines for each of those categories and subcategories of land use. So these form and character guidelines have been they've been largely restructured, as I mentioned, and they've also been updated and improved to focus on placemaking and context. So how the development responds to its context and fosters a sense of place. And the great thing about Sydney is it has this very strong sense of place. It is a place that really does reflect its marine context, and so this is a really important set of guidelines. They also focus on accessibility and connectivity, so trying to make sure that we're creating accessible connections within sites as they get developed, but also considering the adjacent sites and connections through and to those sites as well. Comfort and enjoyment, so contributing to pedestrian and other active transportation comfort and enjoyment. So we want to create these places where people feel a sense of joy in walking or rolling around these places and sites, and really want to spend time there. And then finally, materiality and durability. So the guidelines encourage developers and builders to choose durable and high quality sustainable materials. So that is my very high level overview. So we will welcome any comments and questions at this point. And as I mentioned, my colleague Jessica, who's been the project manager and done a lot of the heavy lifting on this project, as well as Corey Newcomb, your staff member, who's very ably managed the project, are here to answer questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bars, for your excellent presentation. And I'll now turn to members of council if they have questions or comments for Mr. Bars or the other project members. I'll turn to Councillor O'Toole.
Thank you, Mayor. A couple of questions, if I may, in keeping with that sort of very high level overview, Mr. Bars. And one is for your thoughts around form and character versus architectural vision. And so we've maybe seen some feedback from the community looking for, in my view, something more prescriptive to be included in form and character. And in your expertise and your experience throughout the province, have you seen many examples of sort of more prescriptive approach in that area?
We used to see more examples of prescriptive guidelines. I think what you're getting at is prescriptive approach in terms of trying to achieve a particular form or a particular character. Some might refer to those as kind of stylistic guidelines. And there are areas of the province that certainly have those. I think largely communities have been moving away from those kind of guidelines. Partly because I think they inhibit the creativity of the designer, and so designers don't like them, and they can really kind of stifle the creativity. I think the other reason is that they can end up creating a place that looks a bit of a that has a theme that might seem a little tacky. It's a little forced sometimes, and so you end up with some buildings look great, but others clearly have been kind of have been a bit more forced, and so it doesn't allow for an organic unfolding of a style. So I understand why people kind of gravitate and have a desire for stylistic guidelines, but I think they're very, very hard to enforce, and I think they can backfire and not end up with the result that people want them to.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And if I may, Mr. Mayor, next item again, high level, and I know none of us have a crystal ball on our desk, or we'd probably be in different circumstances right now. But Housing Minister David Eby has made some suggestions, I think quite clearly at this point, around looking to address municipalities with respect to removing some housing approvals. So the powers that reside with municipalities currently, I'm assuming you are sort of close and follow that sort of legislative suggestion coming from the province. Is there anything in here that you might envision is perhaps significantly offside from the direction in which the province is going to encourage municipalities to move? And of course, thinking about density related issues in particular there, Mr. Bars.
Yeah, well, Minister Eby's idea, I think, is really to encourage greater supply within municipalities, and I think they're looking at the situation with housing affordability and almost the crisis of housing and lack of housing in many municipalities, and they're considering what they can do about it. And one of those ideas to take back more control of housing supply at the provincial level. So in the OCP, the good thing about the OCP in Sydney is that there is quite considerable housing supply within the land use designations that have been created. So there is capacity, quite significant capacity, well beyond 5 years capacity within this OCP. So I think in the case of Sydney, you're doing your job by creating this capacity within the designations, and so if landowners and developers want to come forward and build that capacity, that ability is clearly there, and it's clearly signaled within the policies as well. So I think in the case of Sydney, you don't need that provincial stick to do what you've really already been doing, which is continuing to supply a good variety and diversity of housing types, and the OCP draft only strengthens that and tries to encourage further diversity within the neighborhoods.
Great. I think that's important to hear from your perspective, and I certainly appreciate it. It's reassuring. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor, for your questions. And I'll next turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Bars, for the presentation. So I do have a few things, some comments, some questions, and some might be more relevant to staff rather than you. So I'll let you guys sort out who to field those. The first thing I just wanted to comment on was the future. So the Sydney Tomorrow bit that we talk about on page 9, and it talks about our growth projections and potential housing needs. And I guess what I was hoping, what I would like to see there is something that provides more strongly our intention to rather than just meet the growth that there's been in the past, what is the type of growth we want for the future? So when I look at the housing needs assessment and the CRD growth strategy, they're looking at growth in Sydney. The population 65 and over is going to blossom even more. There's going to be no growth in children, not in the children, but in that age group of under 14 years old. The workforce population from, I think, 22 to 64 is going to decline. And so I presume that when we look at those numbers is that we're basing projections for our growth and our housing on those things. And I guess what I would prefer is that we make some sort of statement to say, yeah, we know that's what the trend has been in the past, but we want to make a concerted effort to address our skewed demographic. And I know that there's comments, sort of general comments and things within the OCP that comment on the desire for balanced demographic in different areas. But I guess what my suggestion would be is if we could put something more definitive in that forward-looking statement to state our intention. Does that make sense, or is that something that's doable, I guess?
Me, that makes a lot of sense. And yes, I think OCP in planning often does kind of react to trends and react to projections, but you're absolutely right. It is useful, and this would be the right place to do it, to really signal the intent. If you want to encourage a different demographic, a younger demographic in the community, this would be the place to put it. So yes, totally understand. I think that's doable.
Yeah. Okay. And I think it just to bolster that more, I think it impacts our ability as a regional service and commercial hub within the Saanich Peninsula to be able to deliver those services. If we have a strongly skewed older population, obviously we unable to fulfill all of that. And it's also something that impacts our local businesses and our local economy because they don't have the workforce that they can draw on. So just a couple points in that regard. And then I guess related to that is the housing. And so when, you just referenced previously about our capacity over the next 5 years. And so when we're talking about, or when you're talking about that capacity, are you again basing that on the past, or are we basing that on what we want to achieve in the future?
We're basing that on the expected level of growth, which is a projection that you've referenced, and so those projections can go up or down, and they can be influenced by policy, but they're useful kind of foundations to understand the approximate pace of growth that you've seen and are likely to see. Now, as I said, the designations within the land use designations create and provide for capacity to achieve much more than 5 years worth of growth. And that's important because you don't know which parcels are going to develop. You can't really compel private landowners to develop. So it's always important to have more capacity than the projections allow for. But if you want to, further encourage certain types of growth, then you could proactively zone certain properties, and that would send a strong signal to the market and developers to develop a certain type of unit, if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of where I'm heading. I'm in looking at the numbers that were in the housing needs assessment. It looked like, again, we were focusing on the need is for people who are older and are retiring. And so if we continue to if we build that, they will come. And I think, that's what's happened over the last few years. And so I guess what I'd like us to do is build more of what millennials want, so that they will come. And I know that we have within this OCP included some additional places where we can do further densification around neighborhood commercial areas, which is good. We're talking about additional infill in single family neighborhoods with suites and garden homes. That's good. I would be interested in being bit more aggressive in terms of other areas we could look at specifically for townhouses. So to build the things that millennials want, but old people like me don't want. I don't want, we don't want places that have a lot of stairs. We want, flat things or condos. We want yards or no yards, so we don't have to cut grass. So I guess I'm looking whether there's places where we could expand on that a bit more to specifically address that need.
Yeah, I do think within the the multi-unit residential designation, townhouses are definitely an allowed and encouraged use within that designation. So throughout that designation, which is fairly extensive, townhouses could be encouraged. But I do hear you that, within that designation, it could be apartment condominiums could be built rather than townhouses. Right. So yeah. There are also, however, policies that encourage family-oriented residential uses. So, and these are larger units with 2 and 3 bedrooms are also encouraged through policy. Yeah. But I take your point that council could, ask us for greater focus on that particular type of use. I think staff is aware of it. That's a desire within the community.
Okay, good. Just a couple other things. Chickens, backyard chickens was something I know that was brought up in the first report. I think I didn't see it in this, but in talking with staff, I just want to confirm my understanding is correct. Is that that the issue in regards to allowing backyard chickens is now incorporated into a more general policy regarding local food production, and that if council then chose, that would open the door for us to then amend our animal control bylaw to allow for that if we wish. Have I got that?
That is certainly my understanding, but I'm actually going to defer to Corey Newcomb to respond to that one, if you would, Corey.
Yes, thanks, Rob. Yeah, that's exactly right. So because permitting chickens in Sydney is a council decision through the bylaw, all the OCP can really do in this at this stage is provide that sort of high-level direction, and the policy is fairly general in terms of promoting local food production. So that's not necessarily just chickens, but it certainly opens the door for council to consider that. And yeah, staff's intent is to bring a bylaw forward following OCP adoption, if that policy remains in place.
Okay, good, thanks. I just wanted to bring that up because I know it's something that a lot of members of the community brought forward during the discussions, and they might be wondering what happened to that. So thanks for that explanation. And then just 2 more things, if I may. One is regarding transportation. And one of the things I recall seeing during the public consultations was a few comments about doing more to have southbound access to Highway 17 around McDonald Park Road, where the co-op gas station is there. And we don't have that in here. And I know that in the last OCP, sorry, it mentioned that access to Highway 17 from Sydney would only be the area around Beacon and Bevan. But that was 2007, it was 15 years ago. Since then, there's been a lot of growth in North Sydney and in that same area of North Saanich. We've seemed to be getting more complaints about the increase in traffic through residential streets. And I think that the fact that Sydney only has one access point to Highway 17, what it means is that all of the traffic from Sydney that wants to get out of here has to crawl all the way through residential side streets, often at a fast pace. And then they end up at Beacon, and then there's a lot of congestion there. We have accidents. It exacerbates the intersection at Beacon and Highway 17, which is problematic. So having that ability to go southbound at that part of the town, I think would be useful. The other thing I noted is that in our, when we reviewed our regional context statement in December 2019, in regards to transportation, it said in there that the town will endeavor to improve access to and egress from the regional highway system as a public transit corridor for the peninsula with links to the airport, ferry, and metropolitan core of the CRD. So I don't recall at the time whether we were that related just to Beacon and Highway 17, or if we were talking about that in the context of bus service, but I think it's worth starting to have a conversation about that. I realize, staff have indicated that we've got a lot on our plate with MODI, Ministry of Transportation Infrastructure already in terms of redesigning the Beacon and Highway 17 intersection. But I think because it will be some time before we update our OCP again, that it's worthwhile indicating an interest in exploring options on this with MODI, so that if an opportunity comes up to discuss that with them, at least we can say that this is something that's identified in our OCP. So I'll leave it for that. Perhaps staff might have some comment or.
I'll turn to, go ahead, Mr. Bars, if you wish.
I was actually just going to ask staff, Corey or others, if they wanted to comment on that one, because I don't really have a lot to say on that particular point.
Yeah, if I could turn to Mr. Newcomb and perhaps with the additional comment that I think over the last 20 years or so that MODI has actually signaled, no pun intended, but in terms of further access and egress from the highway, that they were looking to restrict that. But Mr. Newcomb?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. We take your comment, Councillor O'Keefe, and this is definitely something we'll look into over the next few weeks and report back to council on. It may be a bit more of a detailed issue than the OCP alone can deal with. The best approach might be a more general policy talking about improving access generally as reflected in the context statement. And then where the opportunity arises, having that detailed discussion with MOTI, regarding feasibility and cost and those sort of detailed considerations that you'd want to look at in the context of a fairly complicated question like that. So we will look into it, and we'll bring something back to council later in the process.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. And again, I was just looking for, as you say, a general statement, something to that effect, so that could potentially open the door in the future.
Understood.
Just one more, I think.
I think we've heard that before, but please go ahead, Councillor O'Keefe.
Okay. On accessibility. So very pleased to see this mentioned several times within the document. One other place I was looking to perhaps add it was under the economic development section. And so what I was considering was something such as the town will work with the SBIA, the tourism sector, and other stakeholders to position Sydney as an accessible tourism destination. I noticed in the economic development section, we did something about encouraging cycling, which I think is good. And this is something that I've chatted with the SBIA in the past. Sydney is well positioned for this. Accessible tourism is a growing niche market. So I think it's worthwhile to explicitly state that as an intention, and that would also help us, guide us in terms of future infrastructure improvements and that sort of thing.
Great, thank you for that suggestion. That sounds good.
And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe, for your questions, comments, and suggestions. I'll turn to Councillor Wainwright.
Thank you, Mayor. So I'll start this off by saying that I'm impressed by the draft OCP, and I like the majority of what I see in there. There are a couple of things that I am not comfortable with and would like to see restructured. And I'm going to ask questions about those things, but I'm coming at this with a concern about our overall timeline, recognizing that if I ask for anything significant in the way of restructuring, it affects the opportunity to put it out for public engagement tomorrow, which seems a bit aggressive and unrealistic. So what I'm doing is trying to balance is this okay to send it out for comment, even though I've got some issues with it and hope they get addressed later? Or are these big enough that it's better to address them before it goes out? And that way the comments are addressing what's closer to the final. So the first area I'd like to start asking you about is the neighborhood commercial policy area. And specifically the concern I had was why that was two separate schedules in the OCP. And in fact, in the presentation today, you put it all on one slide. And just my experience with OCP is if you're interested in figuring out what the land use designation is, you go to that map and you look. And if I was looking at the Lannon Way area on Schedule A, there'd be no indication at all that it was potentially neighborhood commercial. And I might make a buying decision knowing that it's a neighborhood residential. I'm looking at single family duplex, and then lo and behold, it flips. I think it would, unless there's a real problem, I just think it's better practice putting all the land use designation stuff on a single map. And it looks like you could do it based on the slide you showed us. So is there some reason why you think you should separate?
Well, so this is a good question. We did at one point have it on one map. We had a discussion, staff and ourselves, and I think the reason we put it on a second map, the neighborhood commercial policy areas, is because it's not truly a land use. It's an area where we're saying there is policy in this particular area where council could consider additional commercial areas, but we're not allowing those commercial areas as of now. And so it's a little bit different from a designation, but you're right, it could go onto the same map as kind of an overlay essentially, or it could be an additional line that kind of goes around an area. So it is possible, but we were trying to differentiate between true land use designations and areas where there is a kind of focused policy.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge you a bit on that logic, because you've got areas on that schedule that are proposed to be designated multi-unit residential that are currently neighborhood residential. So the land use is in fact not there, it's potentially there. And that doesn't sound to me any different than the neighborhood commercial policy, where the land use is currently not there. The OCP simply indicates that we might be receptive to you changing it. If you see what I mean?
I do see what you mean, but they are different, because for the multi-unit residential, we're actually proposing that the land use designation change as part of this OCP. Whereas with the neighborhood commercial policy area, we're saying the land use could change. And we're, and it's really signaling to council and the community that it could change, but it hasn't actually changed. So they are different in type.
I appreciate your point. I find it a very subtle distinction that could lead to misunderstandings. And it's something I'll discuss with my colleagues of which way we prefer.
Councillor Wainwright, would we be able to hear from staff just to see if they have anything in addition? Mr. Mayor, would that be okay?
Certainly, I'll turn to Mr. Newcomb and just add a comment, which I think is coming from Councillor Wainwright, is why was commercial neighborhood not taken to the level of designation?
That one I don't think I need an answer to. If I
Okay.
look at the land and way policy area, one or more parcels might become the neighborhood commercial and the rest might flip, but we don't know which one. So you really couldn't color it in now. You'd simply identify in this area, these ones might change.
Mr. Newcomb?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think you can blame this situation on staff probably. So Modus did have neighborhood commercial policy areas in the original land use map, and staff, myself, requested that they be taken out and put in a different map. And my concern was simply the readability of the land use map and sort of not confusing people as to what this hashed area was. I take Councillor Wainwright's point, however, that yeah, if you're making a decision to purchase a single-family home in that area, you'd probably want to know that potential future use is a possibility, and so I tend to agree with them that it probably should be shown in the land use map, and I think that's a change we should bring forward as we go through this engagement process.
Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. Councillor Wainwright?
Thanks. I'd like to move on to my second area that I'm not comfortable, and it's with the ESA section, and essentially, I guess the structure of the ESAs themselves, and there's a few ripple things that come out of it. But right now, when I look at it, there are some inconsistencies that I'm really finding very problematic that need to be fixed. And I think that the solution does involve the maps anyway. So I'm going to kind of start off with our current OCP. We have a Lockside Waterfront ESA, and that was removed. And I did ask staff by email for an explanation of why it came out. And for the benefit of the public, I guess I'll just ask that question and let someone answer it. Why did the Lockside Waterfront ESA get removed?
Mr. Newcomb?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the reason the Lockside Waterfront ESA was removed is because it's wholly on municipally controlled waterfront. There is no private property in the Lockside ESA, and development permit areas apply to private property, and they're intended to control development in private property. There is sometimes some overlap, for example, where you have a frontage on, say, a mixed-use building that interacts with the public sidewalk, and you want to make sure that the public-facing portion of that building and the public sidewalk are contiguous in terms of how they're used. But for a property that's in an environmentally sensitive area, the development permit guidelines apply specifically to the land of that designated area. And what the Local Government Act says is that you cannot alter that land, that private land, without a development permit being approved. So because essentially there's nothing to apply to that Lockside ESA area, we felt it best to remove it. There were some other areas, also municipal waterfront or park areas that were discussed, whether or not they should be included into the ESA map, and it was decided that because public land is not subject to development permit guidelines, they should all be removed.
So if I could, I don't support this particular logic. At the time the current OCP was written, we were also aware that it was municipally owned land and that nobody else would be able to do anything that was totally under our control. But it was felt that the environmentally sensitive areas were in fact a statement of the community's values. Here are areas that we consider environmentally valuable. And to not include it then is missing an opportunity to promote awareness. The other thing is that even though it's municipal foreshore and water, the province can in fact issue tenures, aquaculture, whatever, within that area. And having it designated as an ESA would at least trigger the town's involvement. Another point I'd make, though, is if we're going to remove municipally owned land, why do we have Ray Creek Park, which is municipally owned, as an ESA? Why is the park at the mouth of Mermaid Creek also in the ESA? Why are the various beach accesses around Roberts Bay, which are parks, also in the ESA? So we're not being consistent about it. And I'm not arguing about taking those things out. I think it would be fairly trivial for us to put the Lockside waterfront one back in. It's not going to affect any private property. And I think that there is some value in that awareness opportunity. Now, another thing about the maps is, even though it's the Marine Foreshore ESA, there's actually no water, no marine areas in that ESA at all. It's totally land. But when you read the text of the guidelines, for example, 4.5.42, it talks about deep water zones. And there are various references to eelgrass beds, which are also in the water. An example would be 4.5.41. So this really doesn't seem like it's got some problems with consistency, and I think it would make a lot more sense to put Roberts Bay, the water, back in the ESA and include the Mermaid Creek estuary. Now, the other thing about the maps that I was somewhat uncomfortable with, and again, this is one that I'd put out there and see what people think, but in my view, the Marine Foreshore ESA was actually 4 ESAs that overlap, and they only partly overlap. So Beaufort Grove is a specific area where the interest is a relic stand of coastal Douglas fir. We've got the Mermaid Creek estuary, where the environmentally sensitive area is in fact the estuary. Not really a riparian area. And the areas that we're calling riparian area that are reasonably inland, that's future thinking. They're not environmentally sensitive at all at the moment. Then we have the Roberts Bay one. And the last thing we've got are the great blue heron colonies. And you can't tell where they are. And those have a buffer zone around them. And I don't think we've got the entire buffer zone for one of the colonies in there. But the thing is that the guidelines related to the heron nests are entirely different than what you would be looking at for some other areas of that ESA. And I also think we're, even the way we're naming them, we're missing out on this awareness opportunities kind of aspect of it. We've got this riparian area ESA. It's the Ray Creek ESA. It is the last salmon-bearing creek left in Sydney. Nowhere do we say that. I mean, we do have one thing that talks about endangered species, but we have the opportunity, like this stuff's on title. People see this. The brokers see it. A lot of people see it. This is an opportunity for people to know that they're living near a heron colony. Not that they're in a large ESA that extends over, a large section of the waterfront, but a little more focused awareness. So I guess I was I'm interested in seeing that get restructured, the maps redone, and actually winding up being broken out again as separate areas. But I recognize that's a pretty substantial revision, and that's going to impact timeline. So I guess what I'm kind of doing and throwing it out as the question is, do staff or the consultant see merit in any of those changes? And do you have any feel for how long that might take?
I'll turn to Mr. Newcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I just thought it might be helpful to give a brief background on how Modus and staff ended up with this structure of ESA in the draft OCP. So I myself have worked with the ESA development permit guidelines for over 10 years. And in that time, from a practical administrative standpoint, so in terms of processing development permit applications on these properties, there isn't a lot of difference, and I fully recognize Councillor Wainwright's point about the sort of public awareness aspect of the DP guidelines, but from an administrative point of view, there is very, very little, if any, functional difference between the sort of DP sub-areas that currently exist in the OCP. So many of the guidelines are the same or repeated between the areas. The general, I think, thrust of the development permit areas is very similar in each area. And so I think staff felt that combining them and sort of having a more general approach to what we're trying to do in those areas was a good way to go. And so we, recognizing that there's two sort of environments, the marine kind of foreshore environment and the riparian environment, these two categories were developed. Again, from an administrative standpoint, the Lockside ESA and some other areas were removed because, again, there's no practical use for those from staff sort of development processing standpoints. I guess the last thing I'd mention is that many of the environmental restrictions around this area, so whether they be blue heron nesting, provincial guidelines, or not altering the foreshore beyond your property line, those are things that are going to apply regardless of how the town's own DP areas function, because those are provincial and or federal restrictions on the way a property can be used. So simply because the town doesn't have a buffer that may be required by the provincial or federal government around a nesting area doesn't mean that doesn't apply. I think where staff is coming at this is from a bit more of a practical standpoint, in that, within that buffer area, there is a very large parking lot with no trees and a bunch of boats on it. And if that property were to be made a DP area, what practical benefit, we're looking at what practical benefit could there be to including that property? And the conclusion is really none, and it's sort of an administrative burden to have that property owner go through a DP area process when really there's no trees to save, there's no natural environment to protect, and it would be very difficult in those circumstances to sort of ask that property owner to rehabilitate a portion of their property in support of, I guess, the nesting area. So fully acknowledging Councillor Wainwright's points about the public awareness value of this, from an administrative standpoint, there's some very good reasons why we've ended up in the areas we have. I do think that that there is a way to integrate some of Councillor Wainwright's points in terms of, potentially we could split up some of these areas to further differentiate what we're trying to protect in those areas, and also remove some or add back in some of those public lands that may have a public awareness value. And I think that can be done in the context of the next 6 weeks, and bringing a draft back to council within that time, and we would report back to council in what changes have been made and how each of those details have evolved as we've looked at it. So I do see Rob's hand up as well, if he wants to chime in.
I'll first turn to Mr. Humble, and then I'll turn to Mr. Bars.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think Councillor Wainwright was also asking about what kind of potential delay we might be looking at if we were to revise the draft OCP in advance to going out to the community. So I think from a staff perspective, we'd probably be looking at minimum a 2-week delay. The next council opportunity is March 14th. So we'd be talking about turning around a rewritten section or sections within about a 10-day time frame in order to meet that March 14th deadline. We'd also be looking at probably having to rework some engagement opportunities that are currently right now being planned, and so we'd have to rework the timelines associated with those. So, but minimum would be looking at a 2-week delay.
Thank you, Mr. Humble. I'll turn to Mr. Burrs.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Wainwright, I think you make some excellent points about, especially I'm struck by the kind of public awareness aspect of the ESAs, and I wonder if there is a different approach that we could take, which would be to, rather than designate all of these areas separately and designate kind of public areas, but actually to have a separate ESAs map with some additional information that describes the different qualities of the environment across, well, in the different areas. So rather than do it through development permit area designations, do it through an ESA map. So we would, put Lockside onto the map and describe the value of the Lockside shoreline. We could identify potentially the herring nesting areas and the value of Ray Creek. So would that achieve your objective of the public awareness piece if we did that separately on a map and some further descriptions of the areas on the map?
Yes, I think that would. I do think to deal with some of the text about the water areas that you have to put Roberts Bay, the marine area, back in. But I don't see why you would need to make it more than one ESA if you provide the kind of highlighting you described. And maybe that is the most practical way of doing it because it keeps it simple for development services.
Thank you. A question I have is appreciating the staff explanation of from a development process standpoint, but in addition to the public awareness benefit, is do staff we have the municipality, the town has responsibility for the stewardship of these foreshore areas. Why would we not designate them as environmentally sensitive areas, not for development process standpoint, but from a stewardship standpoint within our OCP?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's a good question. I think the reason is because environmentally sensitive areas, I guess I'll be more specific than that. Environmentally sensitive development permit areas are a specific legal thing in the Local Government Act that provide municipalities the authority to control development on that land for the purpose of environmental preservation or restoration. We certainly could, as Rob is suggesting, identify some areas where I think we as a community care deeply about the environmental aspects of those areas. I think what we've tried to do in this OCP is strengthen some of the policy around parks or the environment generally to guide the way the town treats its public lands, and a lot of the work we did with the Wasanich Leadership Council also spoke to that in terms of bringing a First Nations perspective into the way we deal with parks and public lands. But I think for administrative purposes, it is valuable to differentiate between where we have that land use authority and specifically use it on private property and what might be a higher level policy goal for the way we treat our public lands. I think that's very doable to differentiate those two things in a sensitive way in the draft OCP, and it's definitely something we can look at.
So if we were to do that, then we would have policy in those attached to that as well.
That's correct, yeah. So it would be more general policy that council could consider as, for example, if you're looking at a park redevelopment or something like that. And I think there is a bit of stuff in there about Ray Creek Park, Breather Park, and Peter Grant Park, if memory serves, where we talk about if we're going to put in, say, a swing set or something like that, that kind of hard park infrastructure, we will do it away from the natural areas in those parks to preserve them. So that content is in there. It's specific to those three parks in that case, but there is some other general content, policy content in the draft that speaks to that, acknowledging that it could probably be made a little more specific.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question partially with environmentally sensitive areas, but I'll turn back to Councillor Wainwright. You have the floor if you wish to continue.
Thank you, Mayor. I think it would make sense to allow the discussion to continue about the ESA portion. And then, when that's done, I can pick up with my next item.
Okay, I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe if you wish to speak to ESA.
Yes. So what I'm understanding from staff is that there's legislative legal repercussions to calling something an environmentally sensitive area, and there also seems to be we're unsure about whether some areas are ESAs or not, but they do have we want to treat them environmentally in a good way. And I guess getting to the mayor's point, I'm just wondering, can we just create a new category, something called like community stewardship areas that don't necessarily have any legal connotations, but would identify that, okay, maybe there's not going to be any development there, but there are areas that we want the public to know about that we are going to treat in an environmentally sensitive way, but not as we would under an ESA. Is that an option? Does that make any sense?
I'll turn to Mr. Newcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I'm not saying that there are implications to including both public land and private land in ESAs. All I'm saying is that's the reason that staff took the public land out, because we didn't see a practical benefit from that administrative standpoint. We've had public land in our ESAs for well over 10 years now, and it hasn't been an issue at all. We just haven't really looked at it. The Lockside linear waterfront park, if I'm naming it correctly, was redeveloped during that time when it was designated an ESA, and I wasn't here at the time, but I'm sure it drove some of our thinking around what the town planned to do there and how it was redeveloped. Potentially it could have been a hard boardwalk the whole way along, and did we choose to do a more greenscape approach because of that? It's possible, I don't know. But yes, it is possible to have that public land designation as well, and I'm happy to take council direction on that. All I was saying was that staff took it out because there was no administrative benefit to it.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm just proposing is that if there's an administrative hurdle there, let's just call it something different that has no administrative hurdles attached to it, so that area that Councillor Wainwright mentioned, we call it something else, and it just signifies to the community that that's an important environmentally stewardship area or something. So I'll just leave it at that. That's my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe, and I'll just have a question on ESA before turning it back to Councillor Wainwright, and that is the map clearly shows with black borders the properties proposed to be added to the ESAs, but it just brings a question to mind. Are the residences bordering the riparian area in the Reed Creek area, are they all currently within properties in the ESAs?
Yes, the Ray Creek area is, as currently shown, is all those properties are already ESA areas from the 2007 OCP.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Wainwright.
Mr. Mayor, I see Mr. Bars has his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Bars.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think the key distinction that we're trying to make here is, and I do acknowledge that our labeling has created some of this confusion. So we're trying to distinguish between environmentally sensitive development permit areas and just environmentally sensitive areas. So the map is showing what we consider environmentally sensitive development permit areas. And as Mr. Newcomer says, those apply to private land only. So we could have a map of environmentally sensitive areas that also included public lands. And that would be, I think, a very legitimate thing to do, as Councillor Wainwright has indicated. We could have policies associated with those environmentally sensitive areas. Really what the map in your document on page 131 of 132 is showing is environmentally sensitive development permit areas. So that's the distinction we need to make, I think, in this discussion.
Thank you for that. Councillor Wainwright?
If I could, Ray Creek Park is municipal land, and you've got it as an ESA. So the map doesn't show what you just said. And I don't have a problem with what you just said. We just need to make the map consistent with that. And I do think it would be useful to have a separate ESA map versus the ESA DP areas. At any rate, I think we've dealt with this one. So the next issue I had is it's not really going to be a change in the report, I don't think, but it keeps coming up in these discussions, and it's an area that I have concern about, and this is what designations have changed. And you had a slide in your presentation of the designations that had changed, other than those sort of trivial technical ones. But that actually wasn't all the ones that were changed, and there was actually, I think, even a mistake on your map. So to point out a couple of them, the gateway parcel in the current OCP is COM3, and in the new OCP, it's proposed to be downtown commercial, which I confess I don't understand why it would be lumped in with downtown commercial, because I don't see, the 3 stories and the active storefronts and some of the other things really making sense. But the thing I'd point out is that is in fact a change that you didn't highlight. There are a variety of changes from Res 2 to neighborhood residential, and the entire Summergate Village has flipped. And I had a conversation with Mr. Newcomb, and I understand that is a change effectively in name and does not have any substantial effect. But I anticipate that the residents of Summergate, when they notice it, will want to know, why is that changing? And there's not only is there no explanation of it not changing, but we're not even acknowledging that it's changed. And another example is the Cedarwood parcel. You've indicated on your slide in this particular PowerPoint that the neighborhood commercial part was changing, but the multi-unit residential part wasn't. It's actually the other way around. And I know it's going to be a key interest for that neighborhood of what does the OCP say about the Cedarwood. So we better flag that as, there's been a change here and here's why. So what I'm kind of looking at is, I think it is important, but I think there are 3 types of changes. There are substantive changes, which you pointed out on your figure. Then there are changes that are of a minor technical nature, like it's always been a park and now we're just acknowledging it's a park. And then there are ones that are a change that we believe is not significant and will not have any substantive effect. Summergate Village flipping. So I think we have to try to identify or be prepared to identify, here are the three different types of changes, here's where they all are, and we have to be prepared to offer some explanation. Why did we make Gateway downtown commercial? What does the designations around the Cedarwood Motel mean about its future development? What does the OCP say it changes about Summergate mean for form and character? I don't know exactly all the things that need to be in that list, but every time I've kind of asked the question of what designations have changed, I've got a different answer. A couple of cases we found mistakes, that's great, but the thing is there are people who will be looking at the PowerPoint you put up tonight, and it's got some things that aren't identified, and it's got a mistake. And I'm just very concerned that we put out good information that doesn't confuse people, and also that some of these explanations are available early in our public engagement rather than after people start complaining. Because I kind of look back to some of our other engagements, like we had over Beacon Wharf, and we started the engagement before we did the open houses and had a lot of information out. And the input we got in early in our engagement wasn't as valuable, and some people actually changed their minds and gave us different input later on after they'd seen the information. I'd like to make sure we're getting the info out early. I don't think I really had a question in there, but it's a concern.
And Councillor Wainwright, if I might ask a question, in a conversation we had outside, you made reference to Q&A. Is that a suggestion you have for some of that information during the early stages of engagement?
I would make a suggestion like that, but now we're starting to talk about Mr. Newcomb's staff report, and not this this part. So I'm trying to balance this a bit, asking questions and concerns about it, and not actually getting too far into that phase of it.
Certainly, and we do want to distinguish between the draft OCP document and versus the engagement process that will come forth during Mr. Newcomb's presentation. So I'll turn back to councillors with questions for Mr. Barr. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. Just following up on a couple things Councillor Wainwright said. I would be interested to know why did we change the Gateway parcel to downtown commercial? As I hear him explain that, it makes me wonder what was the rationale for that.
Mr. Newcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If council recalls, early on in this project, the idea of coordinating between the town of Sydney, the district of North Saanich, and the district of Central Saanich was raised, and looking at how the three municipalities could take a more coordinated approach to land use planning on the peninsula. So that was done. Staff have been meeting regularly with our counterparts in those municipalities to talk about land use issues that we have in common. As Mr. Barr has mentioned, we had a regional planning session where we brought together the three municipalities, BC Transit, the Capital Regional District, and some other folks to talk about those broader issues. One of those things that we talked about was accessibility and understandability of the documents themselves, and how to not only help residents better understand the OCP, but also better understand the OCP across the peninsula, the three OCPs across the peninsula. And one of the things we talked about was a common land use designation system where, just because you're coming from Saanich into Sydney, doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, the idea of the land use designation needs to change. And so an attempt was made to harmonize to the degree possible those land use designations, and the sort of West Sydney commercial designation obviously becomes redundant in that scenario. And so we talked about you know, the implications of extending that downtown commercial designation to the other side of the highway. And because OCP land use designations are very high level land use designations, the word downtown on the front of commercial is really just a bit of a descriptor. And what that commercial designation signals is that you're going to have obviously some kind of commercial development there and commercial uses. And those uses, that type of development, what it looks like, how high it is, the setbacks, all of those things are determined by the zoning. And so council will, there is zoning there already. You know, in the future, council may wish to amend that zoning. And if that zoning is amended, it must, in being compliant with the official community plan, have some level of commercial use. Now, Councillor Wainwright earlier mentioned, I think, that, you know, will it be sort of 3 stories or have that sort of street presence that we think of for the downtown commercial area? 3 stories doesn't sound possible because of the proximity to the runway, but it very well could have some of those features. It also could have features that don't look like that, and in staff's opinion, the downtown commercial designation does allow for a variety of commercial uses. It's the broadest zoning we have for downtown commercial, so it's a very long list of things that are permitted. Everything in the downtown commercial zone, nearly, if not everything, is also in that West Sydney commercial area on the other side of the highway. So I think the short answer is it doesn't restrict us to call it downtown commercial and use that land use designation and do away with the West Sydney commercial, which really spoke to a very highway-oriented type of development. The property on the north side of the highway, or sorry, on the north side of Beacon Avenue West there, was also designated West Sydney commercial, and the idea was a gas bar and a fast food restaurant. And I think the thinking was to move away from that, and you know, if the West Side Local Area Plan is going to be realized, and some of these airport developments, moving toward maybe not what we think of as a traditional Sydney downtown, but something closer to that. And so the downtown commercial designation certainly helps us move in that direction.
So just a follow-up, if I may. So does that mean that the land use designations in our map, that those will be consistent in North Saanich and Central Saanich as well, that we're all going to use those same land use designations?
To the degree possible, yes. The land use designations and the colors were intended to be consistent across the peninsula. Of course, North Saanich, their OCP process is following a slightly different schedule than Town of Sydney's and Central Saanich's, so it remains to be seen what they'll do, but Central Saanich's draft has included consistent colors, yes.
Okay, well, I think that's great to hear. I mean, one of the things we've heard in the past is inconsistencies between adjacent municipalities with land use designations. So yeah, thanks for the explanation.
Thank you, Councillor. I turn to others. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Bars and Ms. Mann, for being here tonight for your presentation and for your work on this project. I'm sure it took a lot of time and effort, and it's very much appreciated. A couple of comments and a few questions. I'm not sure who will be able to answer them, but looking at the document, I'm pleased to see the prominence that local First Nations and environmental issues are taking interspersed throughout the document. I think that's extremely important, and I was very glad to see it as I read through the whole thing. With regards to the downtown west and the 5th story, I don't know if people remember, but I'm not a huge fan of five stories on Beacon Avenue, but I do appreciate now in this document the specificity of which you've discussed affordable housing, whereas before it was a little more vague. So I like that aspect of it, the fact that this is what we're really shooting for, and if you want that extra, this is what you got to provide. And that, I think that's an extremely important add to the document that wasn't there previously. So thank you for that. Not to get too into minutia here, but there's mention in 4.1.12 about food and beverage stands or carts. And we have heard in the past from service industry, coffee shops and restaurants, that that's not something they're very favorable towards in terms of competition for business in a market that's highly competitive, and wanting to draw that and keep their businesses afloat. That's something they might not take. I don't be willing to hear. Interesting to hear what they have to say about that particular aspect. Just in the past, that's something that's come up. Sorry, I got to remove things to look at. And also, when talking 4.3.11 in the inclusionary zoning portion about the equivalent cash and lieu contribution to the amenity reserve, that has been done in the past, and I believe you have over $500,000 in there for affordable housing at this time, but it hasn't been used in forever. So I'm a little bit hesitant to give that option to developers. I'd rather see them have to come forward with the housing we require and need in the community, rather than give them the option of giving us money that may or may not be used towards that goal sometime in the future. That's just a sight on my part. And this is kind of a little thing, but it's a question I hope you can answer. So I'm looking on page 78, and we get into the right above the marine foreshore, when you're talking about planting of an introduction of invasive species and soil removal or deposit, and it says they must be avoided. And then at number 10, when you're talking about natural drainage systems, it says should be avoided. And I'm wondering why there was a distinction in usage of word there. Sorry, I put that on a little fast.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, could we ask Councillor Garnett to just repeat the reference, please?
Sure, yeah, it's on page 78. It's right above the marine foreshore on that part, and it's number 8, 9, and 10. 8 and 9 speak to must be avoided, but 10, of alteration of natural drainage system, speaks to should be avoided, and I'm wondering why it wasn't also included to be must be avoided. Numbers 8, 9, and 10 on that page, yeah.
Councillor Garnett, are you
Okay, page
keen on-
96 of the whole agenda, but it's okay. I have 3 different page numbers on here, so it's
Yeah.
hard to follow. I'll go with page 64.
Sir, that's OCP pagination?
Yes.
64?
Yes.
Right.
Sorry, I'm looking at the page number on the top. There's 2 different pages numbers on the top and 1 on the bottom. Sorry for the confusion, but I'm trying to pick one page number that works. So it's page 64 of the under development permit areas, if that's helpful.
Okay,
Sorry.
thank you. Yes, I have the reference now, so I'm just looking at it.
I have a ready answer to that if,
Oh,
Go ahead, Mr.
Whoever has it would be great.
Mr. Mayor's
Thank you.
permission. So Sydney's environmentally sensitive designated properties are mostly single family. They're not large lots, and in some cases there's a lot going on those properties. And the town has in the past, I think this is a key point too, talking about designating new properties. The town has in the past tried to take a very balanced approach to environmentally sensitive designated properties, balancing private property rights with environmental preservation. So I think one of the concerns that came up quite strongly during the key directions report process was this fear that there'd be a big area adjacent to the foreshore where you wouldn't be able to do anything. It would just be completely sort of no go. And Sydney already does have that, but it's not substantial enough that it would completely prevent people from doing something in that on that side of their property. What it's intended to do is more guide where those kind of things happen. But at the same time, we know that people own those properties and they buy them as their homes, and we understand, I think, that they would like to do what all homeowners do, which is improve their properties. And so I think the guidelines are more guiding how that development happens rather than saying yes or no, it can or cannot happen. And I think recognizing that in some cases it may not be possible to completely preserve what would be a natural drainage system on that property. So it's I think a little more flexible in that, you know, if someone builds a patio or something like that, there may need to be non-natural drainage solutions there, hopefully working in concert with a natural solution, but acknowledging that it's not 100% possible to do that. If that makes sense.
Yep, thank you. If I may, Mr. Mayor.
Certainly.
On the Schedule B neighborhood commercial policy areas that Councillor Wainwright has spoken to earlier, I'm curious as to the Lannon Way, Green Glade, Weiler Avenue West choice and what the rationale was behind that particular placement of the neighborhood commercial.
Take that one as well.
Mr. Newcomb?
Really the proximity to the community center across the street there. Just having, it's more of a major corridor in that Weiler Avenue West is sort of the east-west corridor there. It's a connection between the Lockside Trail, the highway overpass, and the what's that airport trail called? The flight path trail.
If I might
So-
further ask, just were you perceiving that the entrance and egress would be off of Lannon or Weiler or both?
So the idea with those neighborhood commercial policy areas is that we identify them as having, those general areas as having potential for a small mixed-use development that might provide a coffee shop or a corner store, maybe a small office with some residential units above. And someone assembles enough properties to make that happen, say 2 or 3 properties, and they come to the town and apply for a rezoning and a development permit process to build something. So at this point, we're not envisioning anything apart from in this general area. We think this is a positive addition to the neighborhood that'll give people sort of a place to, you know, maybe go for a coffee in the morning in the course of their walk, or people are heading to the flight path trail and stop off to grab milk or something like that if there's a corner store there. And the details of the development would really be worked out depending on the properties that are assembled and the proposal that's brought to council for the rezoning and the development permit. You know, if it doesn't seem like a proposal that's going to work because the access and egress and things like that are wonky, council has the option to just say no. We don't think this is the right situation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess when I first looked at it, my initial reaction or concern was the proximity to the highway exit. And it's let's put it lightly, it's a dangerous area in terms of traffic flow. The way you have to cross over to Sharples and turn off of Green Glade with off-street parking, visibility is a real issue on some days, and the speed with which the traffic comes off the highway and goes up Weiler is being a collector road. they don't often even observe the 50. So I'm just thinking in terms of having added people and vehicles going in and out of places. I'm just thinking in terms of safety. That was my main thing when I looked at it originally. And as far as the Schedule A land use map, and we're talking about riparian areas and looking at the multi-unit residential on Kenora and specifically Bocot, where a few of those properties actually back right onto a riparian area. I've been in the backyard of 1 or 2 of them, and they're basically right there. So I'm not sure how we could put or densify that area and keep the distance at an area where we're not putting too many people too close to that sensitive area. So that was something that jumped off the page at me. And also, I looked in our financial plan and I noticed that Kenora upgrades for us on the east side for bike lanes, sidewalks, curbs and gutters was 2025, 2026. It doesn't speak to the road work that needs to be done, which of course is in conjunction with the District of North Saanich. And so what my other concern in that is if this goes ahead in the OCP, and it's not necessarily going to happen, but if we had development proposals that come forward one after the other and the infrastructure is not done yet, it's going to be hard pressed to handle any increase in volume of traffic. It's already extremely busy. So that's just something that, just to put on, staff's radar, that to try and coincide the two to make so you have that ability to add that extra traffic of people and pedestrians and vehicles.
Did staff wish to comment, or?
Yeah, just to comment on the Beaufort Place area. So if enough properties were assembled in that location, you could potentially see a situation where development is brought forward closer to Kenora Road with proper access and egress, and the town could look at something like, if Beaufort Place is no longer a single-family subdivision cul-de-sac, the town could potentially even swap that land to gain more area around Ray Creek and bring the development forward. Now that would require either a fairly substantial lot consolidation or sort of a phased process. But the idea there is that, that if that area is going to transition to more of a townhouse style of development, then the cul-de-sac itself is probably not needed, and you could potentially move that space back towards the creek and gain some more riparian area that's could be restored.
Oh, that's a good answer. Thank you. And the last thing I want to touch on, Mayor, the West Side Local Area Plan. Of course, now that entire area is neighborhood residential, and I guess the plan for the future, based on what was done in 2016, is that it will no longer represent that, but it'll have mixed-use village and multi-unit residential. And I believe I saw in the document that it was talking about entrances and egresses off of Jean Place potentially for some of these developments, or if they were to happen. I looked into the document, and I guess I have real concerns around infrastructure that we're about to invest in 2023 along Galaran, and whether or not, approximately 200 to 300 residents live in that neighborhood now. I know this is a forward-looking document, but hypothetically, based on what's here, you could see 2,000 people living in that. It is not really a large space, so there's a lot of people put into a small space. And I'm wondering if the infrastructure that we're going to invest money in putting in place is actually going to be able to accommodate that kind of growth, which may take 20, 30, 40 years, but I have a suspicion that once one starts, the dominoes will fall, and it might be quicker than we think. So I'm just concerned about how that's all going to work. And in conjunction with that, the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, with significant upgrades needed at Beacon and Pat Bay Highway, and that corridor along Beacon Avenue West, which doesn't function well now anyways, none of it does, and that's why we want to make the changes we're talking about, the Galaran and Sterling realignment, and the Galaran work itself. But I just have real concerns if you have 5- and 6-story buildings potentially along that stretch, and how, if their entrance and exit is off of Beacon, how that's going to impact that already congested area, and safety issues around that, and how that's going to dramatically impact what's going on, because it's such a busy road for business and industry and residents who live in the neighborhood. So it's a real problem for me to think of that. And the document itself isn't, as I spoke to earlier about the specificity of the downtown west, it doesn't really have that context for me in the West Side Local Area Plan, and I'd like to see that in there. If we're talking about affordable workforce housing, I think we need to be more specific of what that is, and not just say that blanket term, because that leaves all kinds of ramifications for what that means to one developer, to another, and so if we're going to have that happen, and I'm not necessarily saying I support it, I want it to be something that makes a dent in the real housing we need. And so I would like to see that same sort of specific numbers and context of the way it's written with the downtown west, Beacon West section that we have in the OCP. That's all my comments. If you want to comment on that, that would be great. If not, I'm done.
Sure, maybe a quick comment if I might. As I think elsewhere in the draft OCP is envisioning, we would hope there would be a move toward more significant transit use, and the folks living in that area, if the idea is, of course, workforce housing, that they would be not needing to hop in their cars and drive to the West Shore, but being able to walk across the street across Galleran and go to work on a daily basis. And if they need to get groceries or something, hopefully they would walk across to, say, Thrifty Foods or something like that, where you are trying to put all those uses that you need on a daily basis and places of work in close proximity. BC Transit is looking at rapid bus on the peninsula in the future, and so I think we have to be hopeful that those things will come about. At the same time, I think I do know engineering is looking at some infrastructure studies. I think storm drains are something they're looking at right now, maybe sewer as well. But we are looking at the infrastructure over there as well, and I think the build out of an area like that is definitely a long-term proposition. So, the town will have the opportunity to respond to that infrastructure over the long term as that build out happens. So as Councillor O'Keefe mentioned, maybe that might include something happening in McDonald Park and access to the highway there, or improvements to the Beacon Avenue access to the highway. If that is still needed in terms of private vehicle use.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I unfortunately, if anybody knows me, I always like to look at worst case scenarios. That way you're not surprised by something and you're prepared. So thank you very much for your answers, and thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett, for the points you raised and questions. I'll turn to other colleagues, Councillor Duncan, and then Councillor Fallett. And I just want to confirm, I do see Mr. Bars still on our screen. Are you still connected, Mr. Bars?
I am, Mr. Mayor. I just had to move locations.
We certainly appreciate that in a long meeting. Thank you. Please go ahead, Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I guess I'd first just like to start off that I really liked the neighborhood commercial additions and the way they were selected in this. That was one of the big things that I was hoping for in this new OCP, and the expansion of the ESAs. And with the updates that Councillor Wainwright has suggested, I'm really happy with that. I have 3 quick questions. They're quite specific to specific items in the policies. So I'm going to start with under partnerships and housing, bullet 4.3.3, complete a land audit to identify underutilized municipal blah, 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 for housing. And when I read that, I seem to recall having discussed this before, and I don't remember if it was part of when we were doing affordable housing or if I'm mixing it up with something about the CSB when everyone wanted to talk about different selection areas or selecting a different area. And when I saw that, I went, I'm not sure if we have any. And I know staff will have gone through this and so must know that whether there is potential for that, but it felt like a policy thing that we wouldn't necessarily even have the option of doing, and so I wasn't sure about including it in there. And I felt the same way about section 4.5.18 under, let's see, it's under habitat connectivity, about parkland acquisition, 4.5.18 and 4.5.19, and yeah, the addition of additional park space in underserved areas in the community. And I guess the only one I could think of for 4.5.19 would be the idea that we would potentially be doing that as part of that really long-term plan for Mermaid Creek, and being able to do that. So I suppose that would enable that. But again, when I looked at Sydney, I went, I just didn't see any space where that kind of thing was a potential. But I'm hoping if staff can kind of answer whether they looked at that and went, it could be possible, or they had something in mind about as things change to multifamily or multi-unit residential, this might actually apply in more areas in town.
That's a very good question. Thank you. So 4.5.18, maybe I'll start with the sort of land audit idea. I think the idea there is, I believe that's out of the housing needs assessment. Jessica, do you recall? I think it was out of the housing needs assessment, looking at potential land for affordable housing or something like that. I may be wrong. but just making sure that the town is looking at maybe unused parcels if there is a policy goal of, say, affordable housing or something like that, and fully acknowledging that the town has very little municipal land and Sydney is very built out. So the opportunities are not broad. Going back to transit use, you know, if transit does really take off in the next 20 to 30 years and the parking lots become redundant pieces of land, sure, you could see that those parking lots could be redeveloped as something else. Also potentially, you know, redevelopment of parking lots, retaining the parking and, you know, looking at an affordable housing component or something like that. So, you know, opportunities are not broad. I fully acknowledge that, but the idea there is just to remind us to be looking at all opportunities. Turning to the parkland stuff, the idea with 4518, again, you know, not a ton of options out there, but occasionally we do take parkland dedication or acquire parkland in some way. Sometimes we've acquired rights of way to access new parklands, and I think the idea there is looking at not only the human aspect, but also is there an element of the natural environment where we could connect through sort of a greenway or something like that, habitat or something like that. So just a broad policy to, again, to kind of remind us to look at that kind of thing. 4519 is very deliberate because there are areas in Sydney that we know are underserved or will be underserved with, I think, what you would call a typical park with sort of playground equipment and things like that. And so I think that policy is a trigger to sort of look more closely at that following the adoption of the OCP and make sure that, you know, as the community builds out, we are making sure that there's sufficient parkland per person to give everybody the type of life I think they deserve and expect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Turn to Councillor Fallett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, Mr. Bars, and sorry, Jessica, I don't know your last name, for the OCP and staff as well. A couple of questions just to under 4.1.5, that's on page 21 of your document. It's talking about large format retailers, and so just a little bit of language again. So it says in 4.1.5, if large format retailers wish to be located downtown, encourage them to be located in downtown west off Beacon Avenue. And then in 4.1.8, under the third bullet, it's discourage big box or large format retailer. In 4.1.9, retain and encourage small business. And I'm just sort of wondering what is meant by discourage and encourage. Like, how do we as a municipality do that?
Mr. Bars or Mr. Newcomb?
Mr. Mayor, I apologize. My internet was very unstable during Councillor Fallett's question, so I could only catch part of it.
Okay, so page 21 of your document.
Okay.
4.1.5 and 4.1.8 and 4.1.9. It's talking about big box retailers wanting to come to downtown Sydney, and the language is about encouraging and discouraging and retaining and encouraging small business. So my question is, how do we as a municipality do that encouraging and discouraging? What is involved from us to do that?
Well, when it comes to Councillor Fallett, through you, Mr. Mayor, when it comes to development proposals that include big box development, large format retail development, sometimes that will involve a whole site redevelopment and potentially rezoning of the property. And so when that happens, you have quite a lot of power and flexibility and the ability to to require and request a certain format of development. So I think in West Downtown, for instance, we're hopeful that any big box format that comes forward can be part of a mixed-use development that is street fronting or street adjacent, and includes a variety of different uses. So if it's a rezoning proposal, you have quite a lot of power and flexibility. If it's a development permit proposal, you still have some ability to shape the look, feel, character of the proposal through the development permit area guidelines. So that gives you some ability to kind of shape the way that the project relates to the street, or the way it relates to open space, and also the overall kind of character and feel of the development. In terms of retaining smaller businesses, this is where your subdivision powers and lot consolidation powers are really important. So you have the ability to permit subdivision and also to not permit subdivision, and you can also require lots stay small. So instead of encouraging and permitting lot consolidation, you can actually require that lots stay of a certain size. So you have quite a lot of power through your subdivision approval powers that are actually through the approving officer of the town. So I realize, with those policies that are kind of encourage and discourage, they're a bit frustrating in a way, in the sense that they don't give you kind of clear direction, but they are intended to indicate a preference and to use the variety of tools that are at your disposal, which are quite numerous.
Okay, thank you for that. And one more, and that is going to page 38 of your document, 4.341 down to 4.3.44, where you're talking about the pedestrian overpass from West Sydney into East Sydney. And further to Councillor Garnett's conversation regarding the infrastructure being in place, I'm really pleased that the conversation is here in our policy, or the policy is in place, that we do need to have a pedestrian overpass. And if we are looking at Sydney West and the West Sydney Village to increase the densification and to create a less car-centric community, then that in a pedestrian overpass needs to happen sooner rather than later. It's not something for you. This is just a conversation out of what's in the document. So I'm pleased to see that the conversation is there. I'm pleased to see the potential stakeholders who may have some influence in getting things moving around, because I think this is something that is going to happen sooner rather than later. So I will leave my comments there. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Fallon. And I think that turns to all of us as first-time speakers. Is there anyone wishing to speak for a second time? Seeing none, thank you very much, Mr. Bars. We really appreciate your presentation this evening. Thank you, Jessica Mann, for sitting in, and I saw you taking notes and nodding. We certainly appreciate the work that Modus has done as the lead consultant on this project, and we acknowledge, as you have done in the opening of the draft OCP, that there were other consultants that you worked with, in more specialized, and we appreciate that expertise that came to this important project for our community as well. And thank you also for the work with Corey Newcomb, our senior manager of long range planning and project lead, and other senior staff, and also the opportunity that presented itself, and we were able to take advantage of it, and that is with the 3 municipalities, not in exactly in sync in terms of timing of their OCPs, but the opportunity for both staff and Modus to collaborate and work with other planning staff and professionals, across the municipalities in bringing our OCP to this stage. So we really appreciate the work that's been done, and we see some work ahead of us, but I'm thrilled and encouraged of going into this engagement process with an excellent document, appreciating the comments from colleagues that we might perhaps discuss a little further when we get to the next engagement portion. So thank you again, Mr. Bars, Ms. Mann. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Council. And if it's okay, we're going to stick around while Mr. Newcomb gives his staff presentation.
Please do, and actually an invitation as you presented, you know, where the key presenter and Mr. Newcomb answered some questions. It may arise after Mr. Newcomb's presentation that please feel free to comment if you think it would help. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so now we will close that presentation and we will move to 13A and Mr. Newcomb's presentation, which is also on the first draft, but also on Phase 3 engagement. Mr. Newcomb, I understand you also have some slides to present, and I will turn the floor to yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll just share my screen here and go full screen. Okay, so I had intended to give a relatively short introduction to my staff report. It turned into 18 slides, but thankfully Mr. Bars has covered some of the content already, so I'll try to move through it fairly quickly. So I just want to talk briefly about Phase 3 and next steps for the projects, and following that I wanted to address some outstanding council resolutions that have come up even prior to this project beginning, but more recently, mostly in the Key Directions report, and just make sure that we're closing the circle on those items. And then finally, I just want to talk about the recommendations in the report in terms of notifications for property owners affected by some of the land use changes we've discussed here tonight. So briefly on Phase 3, Modus has done a great job providing an overview of the history and the draft document. And so really I just wanted to talk about Phase 3 in general terms and identify that the outcome of this phase is a final draft of the OCP. And the intent is to get that to council in mid-April sometime. We know that the current draft is not perfect. I've looked at it and I noticed a few periods missing, and council's obviously identified some things that they'd like to see changed tonight. I do think that most of what we've talked about tonight here can be incorporated as we move through the engagement process. I didn't hear anything that would sort of give me pause to sort of go back and have to start from scratch in terms of the draft. So. Yeah, so we are looking to move toward a final draft of the OCP and conclude Phase 3, and the way we're hoping to do that is via a 6-week engagement period, looking to gather public feedback on the draft. So it's obviously a very extensive and complex document, and the way we're looking to do that is through an online survey, and we're looking at sort of tiered options in the survey for feedback, so giving people sort of a 10 to 15 minute you know, if you're a busy parent and you can only take 10 minutes or 15 minutes out of your daily life to provide us some comment on the OCP, the survey will be structured to allow for that. It will also be structured to allow for a slightly more in-depth level of feedback where you can delve into it a little bit but not have to read through the whole document and still be able to give quality feedback. And then for those people who are excited to read 120 pages of fairly dense planning policy, certainly that's an option too. And in addition to that, we're happy to, the survey, we're happy to take emails or letters or even have in-person discussions at the town hall with anyone who's interested. So in addition to the survey and feedback through emails, etc., the other option that we're working on right now is open houses. And fortunately, we have finally reached a stage in the COVID-19 pandemic where open houses are again an option. And so we're pleased to be planning for some in-person open house options, as well as virtual, just to give people with varying levels of comfort some options to choose from. The fourth way we're going to be engaging with people is through social media. So we'll have a bit of a social media campaign over the next couple of weeks, and you know, any comments that come up or discussions that happen on social media like Facebook, we'll bring those back to as part of the discussion. And given the council go ahead, if we get that tonight, we will also bring our stakeholders, First Nations partners, and engage with any town committees as directed by council. So that would all happen via letters and emails, letting them know that we've sort of advanced to that stage of the process. So the 6-week community engagement process that we're proposing here would conclude on April 8th, and the intent would be to bring council back a very detailed report on that engagement and recommendations coming out of that engagement at that time, with specific recommendations that would hopefully move us toward phase 4 and moving into that bylaw adoption phase. So that's sort of an overview of what we're looking at in the next little while, if council is amenable to seeing this project move ahead. And so the next thing I wanted to talk about was just making sure that some of those council resolutions had been addressed. So looking at the list here, we've got, again, discussed a little bit tonight, but there was a council resolution from pre-OCP project that talked about including these blue heron nesting areas in the environmentally sensitive areas. And then the remainder of these council resolutions come out of the key directions reports. So expanding those opportunities for garden suites, policies around a cycling network, the height allowance map for the downtown, ground floor residential in the downtown, the idea of townhouses around the neighborhood commercial nodes, and the Mermaid Creek redevelopment idea. So I'll just go through each of those in turn here. So this is a map of that northern part of the ESA, those ESA areas, showing in yellow dots there where the known either heron, or this includes eagles as well, nesting areas are. One is already in with an existing ESA area, 2 are on the border of an existing ESA area, and 1 is currently not in an ESA area, that northernmost dot. All of these areas have, as Councillor Wainwright referred to it, as a vestigial coastal Douglas fir tree stands, and those are the areas where herons either do nest or may nest in the future. So it's not just about where the nests are currently, but where they could be. So looking at that northern section of where Harbour Road and Albay Road sort of go around on the peninsula there, that whole area does have fairly dense coastal Douglas fir tree cover, and so moving toward designating that entire area as an environmentally sensitive area, I think makes sense to staff. So those are the only known sites, and most of those areas are covered by, most of those treed areas are now would now be covered by the expanded environmentally sensitive areas. The council resolution regarding suites, garden suites, and duplexes in the neighborhood residential areas, the way we've addressed that is through a specific purpose statement in the land use designation table in that section of the OCP, so that includes specific language around those uses. And then policies 4.3.12 and 4.3.5 talk a little bit more about infill development and different types of, again, court laneway housing is sort of the another word for detached secondary suites. So that policy is in there, and there are also some design guidelines around those uses as well, where they're included in a development permit area. In terms of the cycling network, again, a resolution or the key directions report. As council knows, the town received a grant in the area of active transportation for this project from UBCM, which we gratefully acknowledge. And there was a sub-consultant, Watt Consulting Group, who did quite a bit of work with us in identifying just high-level sort of network considerations for cycling, infrastructure options, and then developed a whole raft of policies around active transportation, which you can see on the screen here. The idea was not to sort of identify specifics, knowing that we're moving towards an active transportation plan, but setting the high-level policy framework for that active transportation plan, which we've done. And policy 4348 specifically speaks to the establishment of a cycle network. The downtown height map, I think we've discussed that, and yeah, the idea just being that we're being very specific about what those heights are and the circumstances under which council might consider an increase. Ground floor residential in the downtown, again out of the key directions report. This is something that staff went back and looked at in a little more detail, and it became very clear to us that this is not something that can be easily mapped just because of the variations in how the little nooks and crannies of Sydney's downtown work. And so we settled on this fairly general policy that would allow for staff to bring forward specific recommendations and council to consider those development proposals on a case-by-case basis in looking at, say, townhouse development along the ground floor. So that's policy 4111. And then this is a little more extensive, but this is again going to the townhouse multiplex developments around the neighborhood commercial nodes. And so just zooming in on some of these specific mapped areas where the OCP is proposing to include those. So here's the areas in proximity to Rest Haven Store, which is circled in black on the map there, the little red piece. And the section over toward Melville Park there again, in an area that's already largely multifamily on the north side of Rest Haven, and is developing out as multifamily on the south side of Rest Haven, east of this designated area. So those deep lots and in the location in front of Melville Park did make sense to include in this. And it's also a short walk to the Rest Haven store area and the Harbor Road businesses as well. Along Bower Bank, so the area here on the west side of Bower Bank is already and has been for quite some time designated as multi-unit residential, currently called multifamily residential in our existing OCP. And the idea here is creating a bit of a corridor, so designating that east side of Bower Bank as multi-unit residential and looking at some townhouse opportunities there. The black circled area on the west side of Bower Bank is the neighborhood commercial policy area that potentially with some lot assembly, someone could look at maybe a small mixed-use development, again with the corner store or something like that. The large block to the north of that is East Shore Village, which is a fairly dense townhouse / multiplex development on Bower Bank. We've discussed this as well, specifically the idea about BOCOT potentially providing the impetus to widen out that section along Ray Creek. But two neighborhood commercial sites here. We've got Mary's Blue Moon Cafe to the north, circled in black, and the Clare Downey site to the south, circled in black. Specifically, I would say the Clare Downey site has some significant development opportunity associated with it. Summergate Village is there and is a fairly dense little neighborhood within walking distance. And there's also some development in North Saanich along the west side of Kenora happening as well. So this sort of forms the basis for the potential of a neat little village area in that area. And we've had some discussions with North Saanich too about what that could look like in the future. But this is sort of the basics of the start of that little kind of village idea. So the Cedarwood site is currently neighborhood commercial. The proposal in the draft OCP is to keep the front part fronting along Lockside Drive there as neighborhood commercial, with the backside of the property, about 2/3 of it being designated as multi-unit residential, and looking at some townhouse opportunities there. And then finally, we've talked about the Mermaid Creek development idea briefly, and I'll cover it in a minute here, but looking along Rest Haven Drive, the properties along the west side that are shown here are currently neighborhood residential, and some would be designated, as you can see, as multi-unit residential with some townhouse opportunity there. This specific area might be a better place for multiplex or maybe a smaller condo building like has happened to the south, just because there is a lot of opportunity here. There's more density in this general area. There's opportunity here, as is circled in black there, for a little more of an extensive neighborhood commercial area. But again, that would be something that council would determine through the zoning in the future. So turning to the Mermaid Creek redevelopment idea, just a quick, I showed this map to a colleague today and she said, I have no idea what that is. So I apologize if this has a very sort of planner-esque look to it. But the idea, so this little call out here is just showing how potentially a 4-lot land assembly at the corner of Malaview and 5th, that's southeast corner, sorry, the northwest corner of Malaview and 5th, the southeast corner of the box, could look like and could facilitate pulling the building away from the Mermaid Creek. Currently it's a piped area, but could potentially be a daylit area of the creek. So the 4-lot assembly would potentially become say a 3-story small apartment building. That area next to where the creek bed is could be pulled back and a little bit of green space added there, a daylit creek. The lot to the north, 10165 that you can see there, currently has open channel creek running through it, and it continues along to the north a little bit more as well. So there's already sort of the potential to connect into an open channel area there. So that's just sort of an example of the way that a multifamily designation there and opening up the opportunity for a development that could pull the buildings back from the creek bed would work. And I just wanted to point out as well the new designations in on the right-hand side, they're circled in red for a new sort of riparian environmentally sensitive area. So those properties are all properties with either existing open channel creek for Mermaid Creek, or they're directly adjacent to a section of open channel, and the redevelopment of those properties could affect the open channel by increasing stormwater runoff or something like that. So that's the rationale behind designating those properties as ESA. Those are the ones where, especially that center 10165, there's a fairly natural and open channel creek area in the back of them, and there's something worth protecting there. And as hopefully redevelopment opportunities happen, you could see that either being expanded or, if there is land dedication, you're looking at potentially, say, a municipal park or linear trail or something like that that would help protect those areas. So that's the general idea with the Mermaid Creek redevelopment concept and the reason for that land use change in that area. Again, there's the Malaview and Rest Haven neighborhood commercial area there as well, so it's an area where there's already some existing density and services as well as transit, so it does make sense to change the land use in that area. And just one other multi-unit neighborhood residential to multi-unit residential land use change to touch on. It's actually not just neighborhood residential, it's neighborhood residential and neighborhood intensive residential at the south end of this collection of properties. But the idea here is specifically that we heard quite strongly in the engagement process that people would like to see the waterfront walkway extended. And one way to do that is to encourage redevelopment on those waterfront properties and pull the buildings back and free up room for a walkway. So that's what's being proposed here with these land use changes. They're all quite large lots. Most of them are single family that could be redeveloped. Some of them are very nice homes that may take quite a bit of time to redevelop, but it is the potential is there. And then bringing that waterfront walkway north to Rothsay and then back out to 3rd Street. From Rothsay north, that's where the new designated ESA, Marine Foreshore ESA properties would be. So there's sort of a change there. You're coming up from the downtown and you're walking past the marina, and there's a very sort of human element to the foreshore in that area already, and that would be extended slightly. And then as you go north of Rothsay, you'd be getting into that very natural area and looking at further protections along the marine foreshore. So moving to notifications of affected property owners very quickly. What staff are proposing is that we send letters to these neighborhood residential to multi-unit residential converted properties and letting them know that this land use change is happening. It would provide some additional context, such as this is only a land use designation in the OCP. This is not permission to develop. So being very clear that additional council oversight and approvals would be necessary for anything to happen on these properties. This is simply an indication of the direction of future land use. Slightly different, but I think equally important for these property owners in the newly designated ESA areas that are being proposed. So this isn't a land use change. The single family, or in some cases multifamily land uses, would remain, but the town is indicating that we would have greater control over these properties if there is a redevelopment or additions or things like that where the land would be altered. And so letting these property owners know that they're being proposed to be part of that. And again, I think highlighting for them that the town has always taken a balanced approach and will continue, I think, to take a balanced approach given the competing interests on these, some of them are very small properties. And just providing that opportunity for them to provide feedback. And finally, staff are also recommending that the folks, property owners covered in these neighborhood commercial policy areas where there may well be a rezoning application that comes forward if this is adopted, that would change land use in those areas and as I said, provide maybe a small mixed use development with a cafe or something and a few residential units above. That could potentially be the case on any of their properties. And I think the idea here is to be very specific that it's not their properties per se, but this area is an area that we're highlighting as where this could potentially happen. So that's all I wanted to cover as an introduction to my staff report, a bit of a long one, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. I'll turn to colleagues if we could go back to the council's screen. Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. I'll turn first to Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. A question and then a couple of comments. Thank you, Mr. Newcomb, for the presentation.
Actually,
thank you for all the work you've done. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I'll let you go ahead, and then I do have a comment just on process, but please,
Go
please
ahead.
continue. No, I just wanted to, so as we, indicated, the presentation from Mr. Bars was on the draft OCP, and while Mr. Newcomb has made some comments about particulars in the OCP, draft OCP, he is also, the majority of his report is with regards to process. And so if we might raise any questions we have from Mr. Newcomb's presentation on content in the OCP, and once we're complete with that, then we can go and discuss process with regards to engagement. So I just
want to speak to the engagement part, that's all.
okay, so if we could just hold off, and if there are any questions with regards to any further questions, I realize we did have a very full discussion with Mr. Barr's presentation, if there is anything within the content. Seeing none, I'll raise one, and I meant to actually raise it after Mr. Barr's presentation, and it was touched on by a couple of colleagues, and that is the ground floor residential policies within the OCP, and Mr. Newcomb put up a slide on one of the policies. And that is, did staff or did Modus, through Mr. Bars, consider the concept of the downtown commercial area and keeping the core strong and keeping the borders, if you will, or the outside areas as the first areas to be permitted or allowed or envisioned to go to ground floor residential? And I'll do this by way of a couple of examples. So we have a situation where the downtown commercial zone bordered by the highway, the waterfront, Sydney Avenue to the north, and the commercial is just on the south side of Sydney Avenue. It isn't on, it's residential, or the town hall on the north side of Sydney Avenue. But down Bevan Avenue, you have commercial on both sides of Bevan Avenue, but also on 2nd, 3rd, 4th, you have, and fifth, you have fingers, what I'll call fingers of commercial activity to the south of Bevan Avenue. And we've seen some live-work development, ground floor live-work development approved as close as 100 feet off Beacon Avenue on 3rd Street to the north of Beacon Avenue. And the language in one of the policies is when ground floor commercial is not viable. And that seems arbitrary to me. And we had a circumstance where a property on 3rd Street, just 100 feet off Beacon Avenue, applied and was given permission to build a small work-live space. However, when the larger old fire hall property was developed, which included frontage on Sydney Avenue, 17,000 square feet of new ground floor commercial was built. And if we were thinking of ground floor residential use because it wasn't viable to maintain all of the ground floor commercial space in the downtown, it would seem that you would want to allocate or go to the periphery, that is on the south side of Sydney Avenue, or down the fingers, or even the north side of Bevan Avenue, south side of Bevan Avenue, to go to ground floor commercial and keep the core strong in terms of its ground floor commercial presence as a retail and service and tourism sector. And an example is we have an undeveloped property. Properties were put together at the corner of 2nd and Bevan Avenue, and the land is now vacant. You know, an option if ground floor, if we indicated in our land use that that would be an area to go to ground floor residential, it would seem to me to be practical versus seeing property between commercial ground floor property, ground floor commercial property between Beacon Avenue and Bevan, or between Beacon Avenue and Sydney, going to ground floor residential. So I'll turn to Mr. Newcomb or Mr. Bars if they've had experience elsewhere or comment in terms of the thinking that went into the policy as presented on ground floor residential.
I'm waiting for you, Rob, but
I was waiting for you.
Not seeing any takers here.
I'll just maybe, if I might start by commenting that I think some of the live work that has been approved in the past on those side streets has not been particularly successful. Took a long time to fill. I would say maybe hasn't worked out, I think, the way that was hoped. And this policy is, I think, I wasn't in the downtown part of the design charrette last year, but I understand that the idea of ground floor residential was fairly positively discussed, but I think staff have concerns that you know, over the long term, if we do see build out in the downtown, you know, it's possible, I mean, that we might be underserved by commercial, and we may also lose some level of, you know, I think, vitality to the street. And so I think the policy is really an acknowledgement that we'd like to see that ground floor commercial maintained, but that there are areas in the downtown where, you know, commercial may not be viable just because it's sort of a back street, so to speak. And I think a good example of that is the variance that council approved up on James White Boulevard recently, where, you know, there's not a lot of foot traffic, it's not a busy area, and having that flexibility to do residential as well as a potential commercial tenant does make sense. So I think that was the idea, that those uses would definitely, the ground floor residential idea would definitely be on the periphery, where there was some concerns about commercial viability, and I definitely take your point about who defines viability. You know, a developer's likely to come in and say, gee, this just isn't going to work, where it very well might. And, and staff aren't commercial real estate brokers who have that expertise. So, but at the same time, I don't think we were able to put any more specificity in there in terms of parameters. Anyone can apply for anything at any time in terms of rezoning or things like that. It's in the end up to council to make those decisions. So I think that's what the policy is intended to steer towards, is a staff recommendation and ultimately a council decision on what the right area for that might be. And an acknowledgement that pressure for ground floor residential is there, but should be carefully considered on a case-by-case basis, rather than a map that says here's where it can be.
Yeah, and thank you for that for that answer. I mean, I think there's a distinction to be made between live work, which may not have the vitality to adjacent retail service uses, versus ground floor residential, which is permitted to be ground floor residential. What did come up in the design charrette was you would want it to have the look of go ahead and acknowledge this is ground floor residential, in a portion of the downtown, again, preferably on the periphery. So design would come into it. But I do have the concern that, live work kind of, came out of soon after, if not the tail end of the recession, of the very deep recession in that period. But when we're looking to 2040 in this OCP, over the next 20 years, we've seen population growth with the recent census. In Sydney North Saanich, Central Saanich, we are still a commercial hub on the peninsula, and there is projected population growth through to 2038 in the regional growth strategy. Is that we do need to consider, preserving, that ground floor, commercial space, and I'm thinking we could be more specific, within the policy, but I leave it as a comment, and I appreciate the comment. Mr. Bars, did you have any comment, maybe from experience in other municipalities that have a business district similar to Sydney, a downtown business district?
I think, Mr. Mayor, the only thing I would add is that there is, always a desire to maintain local commercial uses. And you have to just be very careful where you allocate that space, because there is a limited demand for commercial in a place the size of Sydney. And so just being careful not to over allocate commercial ground floor space as well is important. And I do think we were affected by the fact that not only through COVID, but just general kind of struggles that retail commercial businesses are having because of online retailing, et cetera, that some of those businesses and uses will struggle going forward because the demand is just not there. So it was an acknowledgement that that some commercial businesses will struggle, and I think we wanted to have that flexibility so we weren't forcing landowners and developers to put in uses that just wouldn't fly or wouldn't work over a period of time.
Thank you very much. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you, Mayor. Sticking to this point, I was initially lukewarm to the idea about allowing residential on the main floor downtown, but I thought I might be okay with it if it was going to be contained. Now that we're sort of taking off the handcuffs, so to speak, and it seems allowing it for it in not any without identifying a contained area. I'm worried about that. So I'm worried about it because of some of the reasons the mayor mentioned. I think that once we start going through the process to approve one, and go through whatever process we do to determine something isn't viable or not, I think it's going to be hard to say no to others who want to do the same thing. So that's one reason. The other reason, again, I'm concerned about our ability to grow
commercial and retail space downtown. Yep, we had a little bit of a blip and a struggle during the pandemic, but Sydney had large numbers of new businesses start up during the pandemic. So there seems to be a real interest in Sydney as a place to run a business. The other thing I hear from downtown retailers and businesses is how high rents are getting down there. And so I worry about, by us constricting the demand of commercial and retail units in the downtown area, it's going to make it even tougher for our current small businesses. If there's less supply, their landlords can charge more and their rents will go up. In terms of, do we need new residential units? Of course we do, but I would prefer to push them out of the downtown area. We've identified some areas in the OCP for additional development. So I'm more inclined to, let's forget about this idea of ground floor residential and commercial areas. And I'm just more inclined to just go back to what we were doing before. And if there's an unusual case like the one we just dealt with, then deal with those on a one-off basis. But I worry about just opening the doors widely to it. So my suggestion would be, let's take that out of there. That's it for me on that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Councillor O'Keefe. Turning to colleagues, is there any other content, OCP content that you wish to discuss at this time? If not, we can certainly turn to process. Have any questions of Mr. Newcomb with regards to process, and then we will have the 6 recommendations to look towards. Councillor Wainwright, I might turn to Councillor Garnett first. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. The question through you to staff. With regards to the main engagement activities, and I realize it's a tight timeline, was any thought given to, and I always ask this, a special town talk?
Yes, through the mayor to Councillor Garnett. The town's communications manager is currently working on a very extensive town talk that will go out shortly if council gives us the go-ahead tonight.
Oh, great, thank you. And a couple of comments. One, in the recommendations 4, 5, and 6 about sending letters out, I really like that idea. I like the fact that we're being getting ahead of it and letting people know what to. Then hopefully that will actually spur some discussion in the OCP, because they'll go to the document and maybe read more of it than just what affects them directly. The other comment I have is that the engagement up to now has been really good. I've been impressed by the community and their uptake in it. I do have some concerns around that demographic we don't generally hear from, the families, the middle 20 to 40 age group, given the size of the document. And I understand what you said about the survey and sort of going a little bit into it, a lot into it, but I'm fearful that they're going to be overwhelmed by the size of it, and some may just not do it based on that because of just time constraints that they have in their lives. So just something I'm worried about, and those are the only comments I have. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. Councillor Wainwright.
Thank you, Mayor. So a question for staff, and this is regarding the process and I guess it's the recommendations. Number 2 recommends referring it to APC for review and comment. What's not really clear is whether that review is happening concurrently with the 6-week public comment period, and whether APC's comments and recommendations go to the OCP advisory committee directly, or whether they come to council first and then get referred. What did staff have in mind? Because that isn't all that clear from the wording of the recommendation.
Thank you for the question through the mayor to Councillor Wainwright. The intent is that the APC meetings would happen concurrently with the 6-week period. Any discussion and minutes would obviously come back to council, and I think council would have the option to refer those minutes and comments to the OCP advisory committee if they wish to do so. But yes, the intent is if council gives us the go-ahead tonight, we will schedule an APC meeting right away.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wainwright. Councillor O'Keefe and Councillor Garnett, or Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you. So getting back to the survey, I wondering if staff can give a bit more info on what they might envision there. And I guess speaking to previous colleagues' comments about people sort of getting overwhelmed, you know, if you ask them a question about, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, do you like the, you know, the OCP, you know, good or bad? And I guess what I'm hoping is, would survey participants have the opportunity, I know you said that there was a short, medium, and long version, but is there also the opportunity to give them targeted things? So if they are particularly interested in affordable housing, that they can focus in on that, or if they're interested in environmental issues or transportation, that they can opt into the things that are of most interest and meaningful for them, rather than having to go through a whole thing.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So maybe I may not have been entirely clear. There is one survey. There's not 3 versions of it. There's a single survey, and the way that it's structured is that it will give people who want to delve into the details more the opportunity to do that. For the shorter version, a lot of the content, I think, is what we've covered here tonight. Some of these big ideas in terms of land use change, the Mermaid Creek question, other things like that, where I think we've taken sort of the ideas from the Key Directions report and developed them a little bit, and are now sort of you know, proofing those ideas with the community as written in the draft OCP. So I'm hopeful that when people do the sort of the short version, which is answering the questions that are clearly presented, they'll be able to go away from that with a sense of what the OCP is all about, or at least the big ideas that are coming out of this process. In terms of delving into the issues like affordable housing or the environment or things like that, the survey is structured around the goals, and each section with the goals kind of highlights some of those key objectives that talk about, you know, increasing the supply of affordable housing. And so it's a little bit of a teaser for those people who want to go in and look at, you know, okay, here's some stuff about affordable housing under goal 3. I'd like to know more about that. They can go in and look at those policies, and it shows you what pages they would be on, and you know, they can give it some thought and write some comments. Just because the OCP is such a complex and long document, it's trying to do a question about every single sort of idea in there is not possible, and while at the same time keeping people's attention. So it really is for people who want to delve deeper into these specific issues, it really is, you know, if you've got the interest, here's how you do it, and here's where you can give us the response. So it is sort of putting the onus on the resident or the business owner, or whoever, who has that interest, to give us that feedback. But there is, as I say, the base sort of level of the survey will sort of give someone the flavor of the document as much as you can get in a 10-minute survey.
Okay, and so would I correct in understanding that you would be focusing on areas that would be of significant change, that they,
yeah, that's
in
correct.
order to get the,
Yeah, for
things
example, the neighborhood commercial to multi-unit residential land use change is covered,
Okay.
given that that's a significant land use change. That's right.
yeah, okay, thank you.
Just a question kind of supplemental to Councillor O'Keefe's, and that is, does the survey provide, if on whatever topic it is, whether it's housing, whether it's transportation, ESAs, to go into, and just as council members this evening have brought up wording or intent within a particular policy, that in doing the survey, there's an opportunity to make comment on a specific policy.
Yes, so the way the survey is structured, as I said, each section of it is loosely based around the goals, the 6 goals in the document, and gives sort of a brief overview of what the objectives of those goals are. Then touches on a key policy, which may be, for example, the land use change, and then provides some additional opportunity through written feedback, if you want to fill it out, to go into more detail and look at policies specifically, or just we've got some summary boards that you can link to as well, and look at sort of kind of the mid-tier of information. So not getting overwhelmed with the detailed policy, but looking at sort of a more in-depth but still brief overview of what that goal contains. And you know, if that spikes your interest even more, then you can go into the actual document and really get into the wording, and the opportunity for feedback is all the way through the survey.
Very good, thank you. Councillor Keith, did you wish to continue?
Just one more thing. I'm just wondering whether there's opportunity to have perhaps like an online map during the survey, or maybe on the town's website, that would overlay the new OCP with the old one in some way, just so that it's easier for people to see where the changes are.
I did take Councillor Wainwright's point that it would be good to show the community that, and I think we'll work on something that we can put on the project page. I just don't think there's a simple way to do that and show all the changes that are happening. What we're trying to get with the survey is in that sort of base 10 to 15 minute survey level is here's the big changes that are happening. You know, you could spend half a day going through and sort of thinking about each change that's going to happen in this document. I think it absolutely is a good idea to put together a map or maybe an FAQ that does highlight some of those other areas of change. But I don't think there's a simple way to do that in the context of the survey that would sort of give someone a brief glance. So that's not being planned, no.
Okay, maybe there's some technical people that, you know, here's the map, click this is current, click this, and then ta-da, here's the new one. Anyways, thanks for that.
Thank you, Councillor Keith. Councillor Rintoul.
Through the mayor to staff, just briefly, please, if you could comment on the rationale, and again, speaking of the process, I think Councillor Wainwright asked the question earlier, the second recommendation versus the third recommendation. So if I understand the third correctly, the OCP Advisory Committee won't see the draft OCP until they're reviewing the public feedback, and I would assume the comments and recommendations from APC at the end of the phase 3 consultation. Did I follow that correctly? And what's the rationale for that?
So it's based on the sorry, through the mayor to Councillor Rintoul. It's based on the sort of approach we took with the key directions report, where the summary of the public engagement went to the OCP Advisory Committee and sort of, I think, was a check-in for them to decide, you know, is this sort of reasonable engagement or reasonable feedback from the public, and is there anything that I think the OCP Advisory Committee, as sort of the community steering committee, saw coming out of that. So staff have just taken a similar approach, but we're certainly open to a different structure if council has that preference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Keith.
Yeah, thank you. Just to build on Councillor Rintoul's point, is there a reason that we could not send the draft OCP to the OCP committee now, or are we planning to do that? I'm just thinking it would be a lot for them to absorb, to wait until all of the public engagement takes place, and then they get all the public engagement feedback, and they get the lengthy OCP, and it's a lot for them to digest. So I would think an improved process might be to give the OCP
to the OCP committee, or the draft and now to the committee, so that they can start reviewing it, percolating on it, coming up with their own thoughts on it. And then they're very more well informed by the time the feedback comes in to incorporate that as well. So that would be my preference, I think.
Thank you, Councillor Keefe. Councillor Wainwright?
Thank you, Mayor. So I guess looking at the process stuff and wanting to, move forward from here, we've identified a series of changes we want to see happen to the draft. And I guess the question, and we realize that some of the changes we've discussed, we've heard from Mr. Humble at least 2 weeks. But there are also some, I'm going to say, minor changes, correcting typos, putting the periods, and there are some minor one-word changes that could be done before the thing goes out for engagement. And that I'm sort of thinking about maybe 2-3 days before it goes out. So I'm thinking about this first recommendation, which is would be starting the public engagement, the 6-week public engagement period, potentially tomorrow, which I don't see happening, but I can see it happening potentially in a couple of days. The question really that we should have some discussion about is, are some of the larger changes significant enough that we'd like to see them done before it goes out to the public, recognizing it's going to cost us a couple of weeks on the timeline. And we should have a bit of conversation with staff about how much we can get done in sort of the couple of days versus, and at what point do we spill over to, you can't do all this, it's going to be at least 2 weeks. So I've got a couple of minor ones that I really feel strongly should be done, should get changed before it goes out for review. And just to the two that immediately come to mind, 4.3.13, the policy says introduce a secondary suite coast house incentive program for existing homes. I can see us considering introducing it, but I can't see us actually committing to introducing the incentive program at this stage. So rather than build that false expectation, I would prefer to just change introduce to consider introducing. I've got one more similar change. Those are, to me, substantive, and I really would like to see them done. I'm happy to make that motion. The next one on my list that I also think is pretty important and I would like to see done is having the neighborhood commercial policy areas included in that Schedule A land use map. And then the larger one that I know can't be done in a couple of days is the discussion we had about the environmentally sensitive areas.
Okay, Councillor Wainwright, just for clarification, when you were speaking about consider versus introduce, sorry, was there a second one associated with that, or just that one change in that one policy?
There were 2 policies. If you'd like, I can make the motion specifically, but I'm not sure whether we want to get into that at this point.
Okay, so I think it could be helpful. I know we've passed it, or staff has made a comment previously about length of time, but if staff could comment on the 2 policy wording changes that Councillor Wainwright is proposing and the Schedule A change that Councillor Wainwright is, and the length of time it would take to complete those.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, I missed the tail end of that. I was just going to comment that I think in a very short turnaround time, we could make some of those minor wording changes that Councillor Wainwright is suggesting. And if others on council have similar fairly minor suggestions like that, we could easily turn that around in a day, maybe two, but it's fairly easy changes to the document. Regarding the environmentally sensitive areas, I think the community, just based on my past experience, the community is going to be mostly concerned about how it's going to affect their property. And the changes that Councillor Wainwright is largely referring to, I think, are not on private property. So I think from a practical standpoint of engaging with the public and the impacts of those new ESA area designations on the public and their interest in terms of their private property, there is no change in terms of making the changes that Councillor Wainwright suggested. And I think we can make those other changes in terms of public lands and the ESA, the idea of maybe a second layer of ESAs. That's something that we can easily work on over the 6-week period and come back to council with a more detailed approach on that and cover off some of those areas of concern that Councillor Wainwright raised. And there may be members of the community who feel strongly that in the same way that Councillor Wainwright does, and we would already be working toward that, but it wouldn't change substantially the approach to the private property owners who we'd be notifying and who we would be letting know that there's implications for their property and seeing how they feel about that. So I think in terms of engagement, staff certainly feel comfortable proceeding, at least in a day or two, and notifying those property owners while working on updates to the ESAs that will address Councillor Wainwright's concerns.
And so, thank you for that. And so I'm going to summarize that we could amend the first recommendation from March 1st to March 3rd. It would give 2 days, and appreciating that Councillor Wainwright has two what appear to be minor wording changes in two policies and the Schedule A change, those could be completed in that time. Council would have to be other colleagues would have to be mindful that if they have similar wording changes, that we do have to have a limit on that given the staff time and given that we would it would be a launch. So I would just ask staff and even our manager of communications through Mr. Humble if there's any comment with regards to postponing the launch, if you will, or changing the date of the launch, if you will, by a couple of days in terms of social media, media announcements, surveys being available on the website, etc.
I'm prepared to move motion if we're ready to move forward.
Yeah, I'm just we're just waiting. Staff are just conferring for just a moment to answer a question. Yeah, so I'm going to turn to Mr. Humble.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So there are no significant implications associated with, say, delaying it by a day or two. Certainly to undertake the more minor changes that are being indicated, including the commercial mapping change for the commercial policy areas, we can do that. Absolutely, as indicated previously, in terms of the ESAs, it's a non-starter. In terms of being able to make that turnaround within a couple days, we're looking at a 2-week delay minimum. So if we say a March 3rd date, we would have to hold off. Obviously, the biggest thing is getting the town talk to the printers and the potential delay in getting that out. But so we would have to hold off on that. But I think the March 3rd date would work for that. But So, yeah, there'll be a slight delay, but we can deal with it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Keefe, a question on this
Yes.
aspect? Please go ahead.
Thanks. So in regards to the secondary suites, I guess I'll just toss out there that I'm okay with the current wording, and that's what I'd prefer to stick with. And I understand Councillor Wainwright's point about wanting to have more wording that doesn't necessarily compel us or commit us to doing something.
Councillor Keefe, if I could interject.
Okay.
I would provide the opportunity for Councillor Wainwright if you wish to make a motion, and then we could deliberate.
Okay.
You're starting to deliberate on a
Okay.
possible
Sorry.
motion.
And just, I'll just comment then in terms of some of the things that I brought up in terms of the accessibility, the
Okay.
stuff about future growth. I don't think that those are things that need to be incorporated in an amendment. So I'm fine to just leave those to be amended when the draft comes back, because I don't think they're things that would substantially impact the public's opinion one way or the other. So
Okay, we'll wait till a motion is on the floor, Councillor O'Keefe.
sure.
Councillor Wainwright, did you wish to have the floor?
Actually, Councillor Rentoul was about to propose a motion. I'd like to hear what it is.
Councillor Rentoul.
I'm happy to do that. And if you need to wordsmith it, Councillor Wainwright, feel free to. But I think we've discussed this, that we can move forward, that staff undertake with the amendments as discussed, phase 3 of engagement for a period commencing March 3rd, 2022 to April 8th, 2022, as per the February 22nd, 22 staff report, and report back to council with results.
Do we have a seconder?
I'll second it.
Councillor Rentoul, further?
No, thank you.
Councillor Wainwright?
I appreciate the concerns about the timeline, and I'm prepared to get outvoted on this one, but I don't believe it's good practice to put out a document like a draft OCP for review, knowing that you're anticipating making some major changes to it after the review period is over. So I'm not going to vote for this, but I was happy to second it, and if I get outvoted, I'm fine with that too.
Councillor Keefe?
Yeah, I am okay one way or the other, whether we started on March 1st or 3rd. But my issue with the motion was the reference to with the proposed amendments. So I'm not sure what those proposed amendments are, because if it's a proposed amendment about changing the wording of the secondary suites policy, then I'm not in favor of that. If it's something else, then I might be okay. So I'm wondering if the motion could be restricted to just speaking to the time frame, and then we might address any particular amendments that councillors may wish to make.
I'll withdraw the motion.
The seconder?
Fine, I'll have a shot at the motion. I'll move that staff undertake phase 3 engagement for a 6-week period from March 3rd to April 11th, 2022, as per the February 22nd, 2022 staff report, and report back to council with the results.
Okay, so we're not, we would need a subsequent motion then speaking to the changes.
Well, we're going to, in my view, we need to pass a motion on what those changes are. So yes, we will need a subsequent one, but this one sets the time frame for that 6-week period.
I think a preference might be for us to decide what the changes are that we agree upon, And once we've agreed on that, then reset the dates for engagement if we choose to.
I'll withdraw the motion then.
Thank you. Would you like to propose a motion with regards to the changes?
Sure. So I'll start, I'll move that policy 4.3.13, which currently reads, introduce a secondary suite coach house incentive program for existing homes, be changed to consider introducing a secondary suite coach house incentive program for existing homes.
Do we have a seconder?
Second.
Seconded. I don't see any further discussion. I'll turn to Mr. Newcomb, and then I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just thought I'd point out that the Local Government Act specifically says that anything in OCP, contained within an OCP, council is not obligated to act on. So from a practical perspective, this change doesn't make a difference. If council is more amenable to the slightly softer wording, staff are happy with that. Either way, it's basically the same meaning.
Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not in favor of the motion just because consider introducing an incentive program. I think we should be a little bit more direct on what our intentions are. And this is something that we've discussed at least a couple strategic planning sessions. It's something, we've got an affordable housing fund that we haven't tapped into for years. So I think it might compel us more to actually move forward and do something rather than just think about it again. So for that reason, I wouldn't support the motion.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wainwright?
Thank you, Mayor. Just, I appreciate Mr. Newcomb's comments, but most of the public who are going to be reading this aren't aware of that legal aspect, that despite the clear language introduced an incentive program, that we don't actually have to do that. So I'm looking at it just from plain English and expectations of the reader. I think that, you know, since legally it really says consider introducing, that we're better to just make that clear, that that's really what it means.
Thank you, Councillor. Further comment? Seeing further discussion, sorry. Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Sorry, are we... Sorry, if I could take the count again. All those in favor? Opposed? 3 opposed. Councillor Garnett, Councillor O'Keefe, and Councillor Fallett. The motion carries. Councillor Wainwright?
Thank you, Mayor. The second one, I'd move that policy 4.3.57, which currently reads, establish community gardens on public lands in Sydney through operating agreements with nonprofit organizations, be changed to encourage community gardens on public lands in Sydney through operating agreements with nonprofit organizations.
Second.
Discussion?
And just to speak to this one, again, it's a matter of expectations and committing to it. And if it's going to involve a nonprofit organization, we obviously can't commit to it. So I think encourage is about as strong as we reasonably could do.
Excuse me, other discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? None opposed. The motion carries.
So I'd like to move then that the neighborhood commercial policy areas that are indicated on Schedule B be included in the schedule, or be incorporated in the Schedule A land use map, such that there is no longer a need for Schedule B.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Councillor Wainwright?
I think we've discussed this one.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? None opposed, motion carries. Thank you, Councillor Wainwright. Are there any other amendments, simple wording amendments to other policies that, Councillor Wainwright?
Actually, a question through you to staff first. Is it a small change that could be done in a day or two to modify the Marine ESA boundary to include the water of Roberts Bay?
Mr. Humble.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Wainwright. So that is something that we could certainly do in pretty quick order. A simple map change like that. What would be more of a challenge is if we were to start looking at additional policy for that specific area. But in terms of a map change, I would say that's very doable. And likewise, talking to Mr. Newcomb, certainly if there's a desire to consider again a simple map change with respect to adding Lockside again as an ESA area without getting into significant policy, but including that as part of a map change, that would be a simple thing to do as well, and we could turn that over quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Humble. So I think there are two things there, and I have a question on the second one, but I'll go to Councillor Wainwright if you wish to continue.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to decline the second one, but I think that modifying the ESA to include Roberts Bay, the water, makes a lot of sense because we've got text referring to the water areas. So I will move that the ESA map of the marine foreshore area be modified to include the waters of Roberts Bay as it did in the current OCP.
Second?
Moved by Councillor Wainwright, seconded by Councillor Duncan. Any discussion?
Just a quick, does staff have any concerns about that wording?
No.
No. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call a question. All in favor? None opposed, motion carries. Thank you, Councillor Wainwright. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. So earlier, I had made some suggestions to Mr. Bars on things that they might include, and I got the sense that those were things that they could include when the final draft came forward. So I just want to confirm that that's the case, and that I don't necessarily have to make motions at this time to include those things. Those were things to do about putting some more information in regarding our future growth, about adding something about accessible tourism.
Councillor O'Keefe, if I may, I think several comments from several council members, were noted by Mr. Bars, Ms. Mann, or Mr. Newcomb, and that we don't have to pass resolutions on those. Thank you.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just wanted to confirm.
Appreciate the question and clarification. Okay, so I'll turn back. Are there any other policy or wording changes within the draft OCP as presented this evening that council wished to motion that could be changed, or we would seek feedback from staff whether it's feasible to change in the next 2 days? Seeing none, I thank council for that consideration, and now we'll look to move the 6 recommendations presented by staff individually. So if we could have the first recommendation come forward again.
I'll move that staff undertake phase 3 engagement for a 6-week period from March 3rd, 2022 to April 11th, 2022, as per the February 22nd, 2022 staff report, and report back to council with the results.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Councillor Wainwright?
Yeah, I'm just going to be voting against it. As I said, I believe my view is we should make the changes we anticipate doing before we send it out for review.
Okay. I support the motion. I would not support a motion if it were to be made to make changes to the draft. That would take 2 weeks. I think with the discussion that we've had that it's reasonable for the draft to go out with these minor amendments we're proposing. Councillor Fallett.
Thank you. I will be voting against it. I think if we're going to send out a draft, it should be the intent of what it is we're going for. And if there are some changes to it, then I think in my opinion, it's not ready to go out to the public.
Thank you, Councillor Fallett. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. I'm okay to let this go forward. I think, as we've talked about before, balancing the, whether we have an absolutely perfect document or, with the need to get this out and done as soon as possible. In regards to some of the other comments and suggestions, the ones that I've made and others, I don't think that they're material enough to really, where people are going to have strong opinions that they don't want that. So I'm comfortable to see the motion go forward as is. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I'm torn on this one. I think we'll be voting for the motion. However, I'm very sympathetic to Councillor Wainwright's thoughts on this. I know that whenever we send something out for public comment, making sure we are as clear as possible is important, especially something like the OCP, which people have been asking for years. And simply knowing the way emotions can get very high around things. Our experience with Beacon Wharf and ambiguities and misunderstandings could potentially make some of the consultation difficult for staff. I know when it goes out in the consultant and having to explain, we know that that's not clear, but we're going to change that later, is just going to add to that difficulty. On the other hand, I'm worried that if we don't make the timeline and we've promised the public this time, that this will be done this year, that would be a bigger failing in their eyes. And so I'm hoping that, having heard the comments that were made here, the consultant and staff will perhaps be ready. Maybe they'll have a short list, or maybe in the FAQ, they can include what they've heard from council so far and be able to very quickly point the public to that about the updates that will be made without having to make substantive changes to the document. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? We have 2 opposed, Councillor Wainwright and Councillor Fallett. The motion carries. Thank you.
I'll move that the draft OCP be referred to the Advisory Planning Commission for review and comment.
Second.
Discussion? Councillor O'Keefe, I'll turn to the mover.
No.
Seconder, Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. The only thing I was going to suggest is whether the mover and seconder might consider adding that the draft OCP be referred to APC and the OCP Advisory Committee. In regards to our previous conversation about giving the OCP committee the opportunity now to start reviewing the OCP and deliberating on it before they get the feedback from the community as well. So I would still see that we would proceed with the third recommendation, that the public feedback would be referred to OCP, but we would just be sending it out to them at this time.
Councillor O'Keefe, I'm going to rule that's actually an amendment, and given that it's not replacing number 3, that there would still be some discussion about number 3, that it would be more appropriate to discuss that aspect when discussing number 3. We certainly can go ahead and motion, you know, as you've indicated, within number 3, without amending number 2.
Okay.
Councillor Wainwright?
Thank you, Mayor. Given that we've just had a substantial discussion about a 2-week delay in the timeline and not wanting to have that happen, it seems to me we don't want to have the recommendations and comments from the APC go to council and then council take 2 weeks to refer them to the OCP committee. I think it would make sense that this motion be revised so that the comments from the APC are sent directly to the OCP advisory committee. Council will see them anyway in the minutes, and if we want to provide some direction, we can. But if we actually send them directly to the committee, you're probably going to cut 2 weeks. And it seems the majority of council doesn't want to have a 2-week delay.
Sorry, I need some clarification, Councillor Wainwright, and I think what you're proposing can actually be covered in an amended number 3.
Potentially that could be as well. Currently, the motion that's proposed doesn't say whether whether the comments from APC would go directly to APC. And since our protocols is that it doesn't, normally the recommendations from the committee go to council first, unless we specifically say we don't want that to happen, it will go to council and then we'll have to refer it.
Okay, yeah, again, if I could clarify, so the motion on the floor is that the draft OCP be referred to the Advisory Planning Commission for review and comment. The amendment as it was originally proposed was to add OCP advisory, that the draft OCP be referred to the Advisory Planning Commission and the OCP Advisory Committee. That was the proposed amendment as I understood it.
I appreciate that, but that motion wasn't actually made.
Right.
And what I'm suggesting is a different amendment, which would be that we essentially tack on to the end of the motion that the recommendations from APC be referred directly to the OCP Advisory Committee. But
if that would be a friendly amendment, I would accept that.
Yeah, I was going to leave it to Councillor Rintoul. It's his motion.
It makes sense. I would take that as a friendly amendment if the chair is agreeable.
Okay, so I will accept it as an amendment, and then I'll turn to Councillor, Councillor Rintoul, do you wish to speak to it?
No.
Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. I just need some clarity because I thought earlier in our discussion with Mr. Newcomb that the APC's review was going to come directly to council anyways. And so I'm wondering why does one advisory committee need to review the input from another advisory committee? Why can't the APC just report directly to council to say, here's what we thought? Or is there a reason why that wouldn't work?
Councillor, I'll go through to Councillor Rintoul if he wishes to address.
Thank you. I feel like council is going to see the feedback from APC because we're going to get the minutes of the meeting. So we are going to have the opportunity to comment and address those minutes. Mr. Newcomb spoke to the process that we used previously where all of the feedback went to the OCP Advisory Committee sort of as that final stage for them to address it. At this point, all we're doing is having the Advisory Planning Commission's comments forwarded to the OCP Advisory Committee. It might be a little more expeditious, that's all.
Okay, thank you. I'm not going to support this motion. As I understand how it could work out in practice, is that we will be referring this OCP draft to the OCP so to the Advisory Planning Commission for review and comment. We know that at whatever time they meet, whether they meet once, whether they meet twice, in the coming weeks, that the minutes from those meetings will come forward to council. However, we don't know at what time frame those recommendations, comments and recommendations will be available to go to the OCP Advisory Committee. And I have a concern with regards to timelines and the additional input, and would prefer to see that the draft OCP go to the OCP Advisory Committee now. That's not part of this motion. That's to be discussed under recommendation 3. But I think there's uncertainty with regards to timeline in terms of how much discussion APC is going to have and when they're going to have it, in terms of when OCP, would OCP Advisory Committee meet before they've received the recommendations from the APC committee? I don't think, I'm not necessarily prepared to wait that long and see and if it has an impact on the overall timelines. Councillor O'Keefe?
I think that's a good point. I guess I'm just wondering, can we not have a special meeting for APC or OCP to make sure that happens, so that maybe we have to be a bit flexible in terms of the meeting times to accommodate the time frame.
Well, meetings can always be called at the call of the chair. The question is that we know they're reviewing a substantial document. You do want to give reasonable notice of holding a meeting, and I wouldn't be surprised if they chose to have 2 meetings on this. If APC chose to have 2 meetings on this, I'm not going to to predetermine that. So I've expressed my concern over timelines and the necessity for that additional input. So I'll leave my comments there. I'll go back to Councillor O'Keefe, who had the floor, and then I'll go to Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you. So I'm more interested in hearing what you would suggest in place of that. So are you saying that then the APC would just send their feedback directly to council then, rather to OCP?
To clarify once more, the minutes of an APC meeting automatically come back to council. We don't have to motion to that effect.
Okay.
We would have to motion if we wanted them to go elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Rintoul?
Yeah, and I know we're all sensitive to the timeline here, and I think, yeah, it's going to take APC. My inclination is a couple of meetings. All the more reason the feedback is going directly to the OCP Advisory Committee, with council receiving the minutes. On the next motion, the third, perhaps we introduce the suggestion that the OCP Advisory Committee also receive this now for their review, to give them some familiarization. But I'm still comfortable with the motions before us. Thank you.
Any further discussion? I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? One opposed, myself. The motion carries. We'll turn to recommendation 3.
I move that the draft OCP and public feedback from the Phase 3 engagement process be presented to the OCP Advisory Committee for consideration.
Second.
Discussion? Councillor Duncan is the mover. Councillor Wainwright?
I just wanted to let council be aware, staff's already sent an email to the OCP Advisory Committee with a link to a copy of the draft. So and the suggestion that they watch tonight's meeting. I'm confident that they'll get on it quickly.
Okay. I don't support this motion because it's not clearly intended, or it's not clearly specified if the OCP Advisory Committee is going to meet prior to receiving APC review and comment and public feedback. We know public feedback doesn't close until April 11th. So are we waiting, so is the OCP Advisory Committee going to meet one or more times first to just discuss the OCP draft prior to receiving APC review and comment, and then wait again until sometime after April 11th to meet again to review public engagement? Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. I'm wondering, would it be an option to provide a deadline as to when we would like them to provide their feedback? And then they can sort of self-organize in terms of organizing extra meetings as appropriate, knowing that they have to get back to us by April, you know, whatever date that we set.
In the presentation, I hope this clarifies, in the presentation from Mr. Newcomb, when he was talking about engagement process and timeline, he indicated that the summary of the community engagement would come back to council after April the 8th, which is now changed to April the 11th. And that presumably would be at the first meeting of council after that time. Again, if we're, as is in this motion, referring public engagement to the OCP Advisory Committee, there will be a delay in staff having to wait for the OCP Advisory Committee as recommendations before they can bring it back to council. So that will be further in April or May. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? Two opposed, myself and Councillor O'Keefe. The motion carries. So a point of clarification, could staff indicate how the timeline is revised in terms of when public engagement and OCP advisory review and comment would come back to council?
Would it be possible for Ms. Nelson to read back the last two resolutions?
Yes, so the first one is that the draft OCP be referred to the Advisory Planning Commission for review and comment, and that the comments be presented directly to the OCP Advisory Committee. And then the second one was that the draft OCP and the public feedback from the Phase 3 engagement process be presented to the OCP Advisory Committee for consideration.
I don't see any significant change to the timeline as a result of this. Looking at the April council meetings, there's a meeting on April 11th and April 25th, and a committee of the whole on April 19th. Staff would be aiming to report back to council on the engagement, APC's feedback, and the OCP advisory's feedback either April 19th or the 25th.
But the OCP Advisory Committee is going to be meeting after April 11th.
Yep, no problem.
Okay. Okay, so we have three recommendations left.
I'll move number 4, that staff send letters to individual property owners whose property is being redesignated from neighborhood residential to multi-unit residential in the draft OCP.
Second.
Discussion? Councilor Wainwright?
Thank you, Mayor. So I don't have a problem with the motion that's being made, but I don't think it goes far enough. And the specific concern I have, if if you live next to a property that is being proposed to go from neighborhood residential to multi-unit residential, you'd probably like to be notified. Like, why would we not be notifying the adjacent properties? So I think that's a mistake, and I think we should in fact send it to the property owners and the adjacent properties. But I also, in the earlier conversation, pointed out some additional ones like Summergate that I think we ought to notify, different notification, and our motions are not going to cover that. So I'm happy to work through the next three motions in the staff report, but then I think we need an additional motion for notification of the ones that aren't covered.
Sorry, you spoke to an additional motion?
Okay, so I'll just start off. We've got a motion on the floor. I'll propose an amendment that the letters be sent to the property owners of whose property is being redesignated from neighborhood residential to multi-unit residential and the adjacent properties.
Second.
Sorry, the seconder was Councillor Fallot, thank you. Turn to Mr. Newcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think it would be helpful for staff if, just to clarify that a little bit more, if the adjacent property is already a multi-unit residential property, are you asking us to notify that property as well, or are we talking about just adjacent neighborhood residential, i.e. single-family, two-family properties? The number of notifications could increase significantly with multi-unit properties adjacent being notified. Thank you.
I was thinking of adjacent properties, period.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Any further discussion? I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? None opposed. Motion carries. Council wish to proceed with recommendation 5?
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, was that vote on the amendment? Because then we need to vote on the amended motion.
Yeah.
We'll vote on the main motion now, or we'll go back to the main motion. The amendment passes. Is there any further discussion on the main motion? Call the question. All in favor? None opposed. Motion carries.
Okay. I'll move that staff send letters to individual property owners whose property is being designated as environmentally sensitive area, development permit area in the draft OCP.
Second.
Discussion? Councillor Duncan?
It's not actually discussion. I'm just noting that I have to go. My babysitter has to leave at 10. I see that we're probably not going to finish this by the time we would normally have to recess and make a motion to continue past 10 p.m. So I think I'll run now and try and get you guys and sign back in when I get home.
Okay. Do you just want to?
I'll call with the vote and then I'll have to run.
Any further discussion? I'll call the question. All in favor? None opposed. Motion carries. Thank you, Councillor Duncan. And the last motion? Councillor Wainwright, yeah.
I'll move that staff send letters to individual property owners whose property is being designated as neighborhood commercial policy area and adjacent properties.
Second.
Discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Oh, sorry, I'm going to turn to Mr. Newcomb. I withdraw calling the question.
Just one more point of clarification, if I might. If the property is not directly adjacent but across a street, would you like those notified as well?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you for the question of clarification. I'll call the question. All in favor? Carries unanimous with Councillor Duncan.
And I'd like to move that staff send letters to individual properties owners whose property is changing designation in the draft OCP.
Do we have a seconder?
Second?
Second for discussion.
Second for discussion,
Okay.
Mr. Council Wainwright?
If I could then, I think the prime example is Summergate, changing from RES 2.1 to just neighborhood residential. So it's changing designation in the OCP. We should tell them we know we're doing this, and here's the explanation. The letter can go out a little bit later. It's obviously going to be a different letter, but it's going to be a letter that basically says, yes, there's a change in designation happening, but it's not going to be significant because. And if we don't do that, we may get a large crowd of people who think there's a 50-meter setback happening in the ESA. It just seems to me that if I was a property owner, I'd want to know that my property was changing designation. And if I heard that they were sending out notices to everybody who was affected and I didn't get one, I'd assume that there was no change. I think it would be a mistake if we don't send out those notices.
Thank you, Councillor Wainwright. I'll turn to Mr. Newcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In the case of Summergate Village, some clarification on whether the strata council alone should be notified or every individual strata lot owner in Summergate would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Strata council, and it's their problem to tell the residents.
Thank you for the clarification, Councillor O'Keefe.
I guess I would be more inclined to send it to all residents. I feel if we're concerned about letting people know, I think the town should be responsible for communicating directly with the residents and not leave it to a third party to let them know about that.
Okay, we have different intent within the wording of the motion.
I would be fine with Councillor O'Keefe's approach.
Okay, so the clarification is that it will be sent to all tenants of, or all residents in Summergate. Thank you. Any further discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Thank you. Well, thank you, Council. First, I want to thank, Councillor Wainwright?
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. The one thing I think that's obvious, and I think staff's probably going to do it, but we're going to have questions come up, and we're going to need to have responses prepared for people. Like, for the neighborhood around the Cedarwood, what does the OCP designation mean in terms of the proposal that they've heard about at the open house for Cedarwood? Like, people are going to want to know. And I think we should be prepared to put together an FAQ and answer questions as they go along. And the earlier in the process, the better for some of the key things, like, is Summergate Village changing? And, yes, but it's not really a change. Why is the gateway parcel downtown changing to downtown commercial? You can give an explanation. There's a lot of stuff that needs to essentially be a companion to the report. Like, why is the Lockside Waterfront ESA gone? There are explanations. They're not in the staff report, and they're not in the draft OCP, and we shouldn't expect that people will watch this video to find some of those explanations, and we shouldn't expect that people are going to pick up the phone to call staff to ask, particularly if it's an evening or a weekend. So, I think we've just got to work on having some companion information go out as well. I appreciate there's a lot of stuff to do, but I don't know if I should make a motion to that effect. But I would just encourage our communication staff to really be on top of getting an FAQ together ASAP and publicizing that it's going to be a living document and people should look there for answers.
I'll turn to Mr. Humble.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through to Councillor Wainwright. Yeah, I trust our communications manager. She's been diligently taking notes, and I think she'll certainly do that anyways. I think it'd be very helpful though if we could have a motion to that effect, just so that we've covered it for the record.
Certainly, Mr.
Okay.
Humble. Councillor Wainwright.
I'll move that staff prepare a frequently asked questions to be a living document as a companion to the draft OCP, explaining issues likely to be of concern or interest to the community.
Second.
Further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call a question. All in favor? None opposed. The motion carries. Councillor Wainwright? Anything further?
That's it.
Thank you. Turn to other colleagues if there's anything further. No further motions arising. Very good. I want to thank staff for the staff report, for the presentation this evening. I think we have a very robust engagement plan over the next 6 weeks or so. We certainly seek and value the input from the general public and all stakeholders, and we are well on our way in this process with an excellent draft of the OCP to go forward. So thank you. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think we need a motion to extend the meeting.
Not yet. We're not quite at 10 o'clock yet, and we just have...
Oh, you want to wait to the last minute? Okay.
No, I appreciate that. So I'm going to turn to item 13B, and that is the COVID-19 Emergency Operations Center Response After Action Report, and I'm going to move that we refer that report to the next council meeting. Just for the sake of time of this evening's meeting, we do have an item in our in-camera agenda this evening.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor? The motion carries. Thank you. And I would look to 13C. We have the monthly building report for January 2022.
Move receipt for information.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Thank you. We'll turn to item 14A, which is the letter from Ms. Lori McDermott regarding the summer markets. We have it moved for receipt and seconded. Any discussion? Call a question. All in favor? Thank you. And sorry, I did have a comment, and I would just want to thank Ms. McDermott for considering the letter from council requesting reconsideration and appreciate her efforts in conducting the markets on Thursdays and Sundays this year. And we'll turn to 15. We have 3 items of correspondence for information.
Move receipt.
Second.
All in favor? None opposed. Motion carries. We have no notice of motion. I'll turn to Councillor Garnett for a motion to go on camera.
I move that it is in the opinion of council that the public interest requires that persons other than members of the council and officers be excluded from the meeting to consider confidential matters respecting negotiations between the local government and a provincial government or federal government or both, pursuant to section 90.2B of the community charter, and that council continue the meeting in closed session.
Second?
We have it seconded by Councillor Fallett. All in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Thank you. And a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second.
All in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Thank you, council. Thank you, staff. We will recess for 5 minutes before coming back in camera.